What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto's kidnapped and his body became the ultimate weapon of seduction? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. Explosions rocked the earth beneath Sasuke's feet, nearly knocking him to the ground. All around him was chaos. Shinobi from both Kumo and Konoha were yelling, fighting, and dying. The civilians in the area were mostly just yelling and dying. The clanging of steel on steel rang throughout the small town that had the misfortune of becoming a battlefield. In another lifetime he would have felt disconcerted, maybe even a little scared, by the noise roaring in his ears, the sulphurous smell of burning building choking his lungs, and the sight of death that greeted him everywhere he looked. That lifetime had passed into the void not so long ago, but it felt like it was already a distant memory. Maybe he'd started to lose it when his brother slaughtered their clan. But the final nail in its coffin had been the day Naruto was stolen and the outbreak of what many were already calling the Fourth Great Ninja War. Konoha had been using what was essentially guerrilla war tactics for the most part, as was typical of a ninja war, particularly for those on the defensive. They had only engaged Kumo's forces en masse a half-dozen times, if that. Instead, they let Kumo's shinobi get drawn farther and farther in, stretching their supply lines, which were under almost constant attack from small teams of leaf nin, and slowly whittling away at their numbers. Sasuke had participated in portions of some of the larger battles, but this was the first time he'd been there from the beginning and gotten to watch as a once peaceful area was turned into a hellish nightmare. That the leaf and cloud nin were clashing in this town was a slight change in tactics for Konoha. Previously, they probably would have tried to strip the village of food, weapons, and medical supplies and then continued to retreat. The problem was that Konoha had suffered a devastating loss only a few days earlier in one of the rare large battles, and that had allowed the Cloud Nin to arrive much sooner than expected. Plus, they were now only 20 kilometers away from Konoha, and they'd reached a point where the Leaf Nin couldn't just keep falling back. If they dragged things along any farther, Kumo Nin would be knocking on the Hokage's door by the end of the week, assuming anyone was actually using that room anymore. Just behind Sasuke, a thatched-roofed house collapsed as its burning support beams lost the ability to hold its weight. To his left, a woman screamed as her husband, or friend, or brother, or even father, was cut down by a hail of kunai. She tried to run to him, but the child clutching desperately at her skirt tripped her up. The fall seemed to wake her from her incoherent grief and remind her that there were living family members who needed her more. Sasuke spun away from a kick, ducked under a kunai, and then slammed his hand up into his attacker's throat, dropping him. When he glanced back at where the woman and child had stood, they were gone. Perhaps they would find shelter, somewhere, or maybe they would just go somewhere else and die. He didn't know and didn't have time to care. A kunai whistled through the air, catching him in the shoulder and spinning him around. The flak jacket he was wearing softened the blow, but the weapon had enough velocity behind it that it still managed to pierce his skin. Sasuke yanked it out, ignoring the sensation of blood flowing out of his body, and sent it back at the tall man who had thrown it. The Cloud Nin dropped with a strangled cry as he clutched at the hilt sticking out of his throat. Sasuke's red eyes surveyed the scene around him, drinking in and memorizing every detail of the carnage surrounding him. Not far away, he spotted two Cloud Nin looking back in the direction that their forces had entered the town from. Burning and crumbling buildings blocked his view of what it was that was holding their attention, but all that mattered was that his enemies weren't aware of his presence. Sasuke dropped low to the ground, reaching back and gripping the hilt of the thin chikudo he had procured from a Cloud Nin during a mission several months earlier. His five-man team, made up of Sakura, Shikamaru, Choji, and Lee, had been ambushed and had only made it through without any fatalities through sheer luck and his own good fortune that Sakura was with them. The former owner of the weapon had managed to get behind Sasuke while he was occupied with another enemy. He'd turned just in time to feel the blade run through his stomach and out his back. On pure instinct, he'd slashed at the man's throat with a kunai he was holding. He hadn't cut deep, but he'd hit an artery, and that was all it really took. Sasuke remembered very little of the rest of that day. When he woke up, he was in a tent, lying on a raised cot. Sakura's head, her hair damp with sweat, had been resting against his chest. She'd fallen asleep kneeling over him, exhausted from the effort that had saved his life. He would later find out that she'd worked on him for hours without rest and still very nearly lost him twice during the night. Her efforts left him with only a small scar on his stomach and chest that was growing harder and harder to differentiate from all the others he was collecting. Sasuke's teammates had saved the sword for him. Lee had even cleaned off the blood and sharpened it to a nice edge. At first it had been a joke that he wanted to keep the thing that had come so close to taking his life, but the more he used it, the more natural it felt in his hand. It had nearly killed him, but now it was his favorite weapon. As he drew nearer to his prey, he silently slipped the blade from its sheath and rotated it in his grip as he brought his arm back and prepared to strike. Motion caught his attention and he let his eyes flicker along the line that the two men were staring. One look and he too stood transfixed, though his eyes widened in horror at the sight before him. A young woman with long blonde hair tied back in a tight ponytail that was wrapped in cloth was walking down the road less than 100 meters away. She seemed completely unconcerned with the battle raging around her. Kumo's forces clashed with Konoha's on either side of her, but she didn't even look at them. A leaf nin used a fire jutsu, incinerating a cloud nin as well as the building he was standing next to, but she didn't so much as flinch while her companion screamed in agony. She continued forward until she reached what was roughly the center of the town, and there she stood, patiently waiting, as if looking for a particular sign. Sasuke knew who she was. He knew what her presence meant. The battle was lost. Ni Yugito was one of only a handful of ninja from Kumogakure that Sasuke really respected. There were a great many strong ninja from Kumo, but few that were so strong they should be feared. She was one of the exceptions. At times she seemed to be single-handedly turning the tide of the war in Kumo's favor. Sasuke's lungs began to burn and he realized that he'd been holding his breath for some time. Without a second thought, his blade sank into the first of the two cloud nin before him. He dispatched the second before the first had even hit the ground. With that done, he turned and was about to leap onto the nearest building, hoping that it would support his weight long enough for him to find a large group of leaf nin. Before he could, however, Shikamaru and Ino called out his name as they hurried around the still burning remains of one of the nearby houses. Both were dirty and blood-splattered, though it was hard to tell if it was their own or someone else's, and they carried themselves as if they were as exhausted as Sasuke felt. Shikamaru's hair, which was normally pulled back in a spiky ponytail, was hanging free, almost touching his shoulders except towards the back where a few locks were trying to remain up even without the aid of the tie. The back right side of his head was matted with blood, probably for the same reason that his hair was no longer up. Both Chunin were wearing their flak jackets, though Ino looked a little funny in it as she had not changed out of her purple skirt when she put the vest on after the fighting broke out. "Yugito's here," Sasuke said as soon as they were close enough to hear him over the din of battle. Shikamaru looked past Sasuke and spotted Yugito. "Troublesome," he grumbled as he reached up and gripped his left shoulder, rotating his arm gingerly. "Ino was in the head of one of them and found out they were expecting reinforcements, but we didn't know it was her." He closed his eyes for a second, thinking, and then opened them and said, "We need to fall back. There aren't enough of us to deal with her and the rest of the Cloud Shinobi." Ino looked startled, but admirably held her tongue. Sasuke wasn't feeling so generous. "We can't run away," he growled. "We're all ready." Shikamaru nodded. "I know, but Konoha will be easier to protect and they still have a ways to go. We're already attacking their supply lines. They won't be able to lay siege to the village for very long and we'll have plenty of provisions to outlast them." Sasuke turned back towards Yugito. "If we kill her here, we'll turn the whole war. There's still Kurabi," Shikamaru pointed out. "He's twice as bad as she is. The Raikage hasn't put him in battle in a while. They're more protective of him than they are of Yugito. If she's gone," Shikamaru shook his head, "we can't right now. Our forces are too spread out and theirs are too numerous. This town is lost anyway. The best tactic would be to fall back and force them to work twice as hard holding it as we would have to saving it." Sasuke didn't look away from Yugito. The determination on his face made it clear that he was unmoved by Shikamaru's observation. "If you die here, you can't save Naruto," Shikamaru pointed out. Ino sucked in a sharp breath, her eyes widening. "Shikamaru," she hissed. Sasuke's hands curled into fists and the urge to strike Shikamaru became almost irresistible, almost. It annoyed him that Shikamaru was right. It annoyed him more that his thoughts gradually passed from his vow to save Naruto to his vow to kill Itachi. Itachi had told Sasuke to live a long and unsightly life until the day that he had the same eyes as his brother. Sasuke still had every intention of killing Itachi, even if he had to live an unsightly life to do so, but he couldn't fight in the war or save Naruto if he ran away and did everything he could to protect his life. Naruto wouldn't run away from something like this, he replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He wasn't totally sure if he was talking to Shikamaru or Itachi. Since Itachi wasn't around, Shikamaru assumed that he was the one being spoken to and shook his head, his long, free hair waving in the wind. "You're going to get me killed one of these days." That comment was enough to bring Sasuke away from thoughts of Itachi and Naruto. He raised a questioning eyebrow and Shikamaru shrugged. "You'll need someone to keep her friends from stabbing you in the back while you fight her. Ino's almost out of chakra and her jutsu aren't really made for that sort of thing. Unfortunately, that leaves me as your backup." He turned to Ino and said, "Go find Asuma-sensei and let him know that Sasuke and I are going to die unless he and whoever else he can find hurry to the spot with all the explosions." He gave her a weak smile and then added, "If there aren't any explosions, the fight's probably over and he should bring a couple of body bags when he comes looking for us." "Shikamaru?" He waved her comment off before she could get any farther than that. "It'll be fine. Just don't take too long finding sensei." She was quiet for a half second and then gave him a small smile. "I was just going to say to make sure Sasuke-kun comes back safe and sound. Sakura would never forgive me if he gets killed because I let him run off with a dumbass like you." Shikamaru rolled his eyes. "Cute. Get going." He turned to Sasuke and sighed. "Sometimes, I think I should have been an artist or a cook. All this fighting really isn't my thing." Sasuke gave him a grim smile. He was used to Shikamaru's complaining every time things got dangerous. He also knew that there were few ninja who were so adept at coming up with just the right maneuver to save everyone as Shikamaru. Whether he longed for the quiet, simple life or not, Shikamaru was a good ninja. "Come on, we have work to do." Tsunade sat in Sarutobi Hiruzen's room, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the machines that kept continuous tabs on his heartbeat and a whole range of other things. The only other noise in the darkened room was far softer than the beeps, but to her it seemed to almost drown out all other sound. The third Hokage's gasps for air. He was slowly but surely drowning in blood and other bodily fluids as they leaked into his lungs. The pain that the rest of his body was feeling was probably excruciating at times, but he almost never groaned or cried out or gave any indication that he felt it anymore. She sometimes wondered if the disease or poison or whatever it was that was afflicting him had mercifully destroyed the nerves that would alert his brain to the pain he was feeling. But every time she pricked his skin to inject him with something else that she hoped would slow the spread of the disease, his muscles flinched just enough to tell her that he still felt everything. If he didn't stop to mess around, Jiraiya ought to be back today, she thought as she stared through the semi-darkness at the still form of the third lying in his bed. She knew that Jiraiya wouldn't mess around, not when things were so serious in Konoha. He might continue searching for some clue that would lead him to Orochimaru and, more importantly to Jiraiya, Uzumaki Naruto, but he wouldn't mess around much. His last message had been interesting. The Cage's children, whom he'd met on a previous trip, had apparently been able to narrow down Orochimaru's location down to 2 areas. They were checking out one, Jiraiya was investigating the other. Whoever found the base would alert the others and then Jiraiya was to come back to Konoha and get a team of Leaf Nin together to storm the base and bring Naruto out. Jiraiya hadn't found anything. In fact, after a long and careful search, he was certain that the Cage's children were in the right spot, if Orochimaru really was going to be in one of those 2 locations. They hadn't contacted him yet, but he was already returning to Konoha to ready the rescue party so they would be ready to go the moment news reached them that Orochimaru had been found. In Tsunade's opinion, it was all a waste of time. Even if they somehow found Orochimaru and if Naruto was still alive and if Orochimaru didn't catch wind of what they were doing and kill the boy before he could be saved, she didn't think Konoha would take people away from a war effort so they could be used to rescue a Chunin that had probably been killed over a year and a half ago. The council wouldn't go for it on their own and she wasn't sure that Sarutobi could get them to do it given how long he'd been more or less incapacitated. Her eyes settled on his thin and haggard form and she sighed. If only she'd seen it sooner or done something before it had progressed as far as it had. She knew, though she generally refused to admit it, that since she still couldn't figure out what was wrong with him or why it continued to progress despite her best attempts at curing him, there was little chance that she could have done anything to stop him from reaching this point, but it still seemed like she should have done something. He developed the cough quickly, and neither time nor the methylmorphine she'd given him had done anything for him. Then, he began to complain of strange chest pains and shortness of breath. At that point, she'd realized that he was suffering from something other than a simple cold, but none of her treatments had done anything other than slow the progression as he slowly grew weaker and weaker and his body gradually began to give out on him. Strangely, the coughing was no longer nearly as bad as it had been in the beginning, but most of the other symptoms persisted. She, Shizune, Haruno Sakura, and several other medical nen including some top-of-the-top doctors in the village all the way down to some genin showing promise had worked on hundreds of treatments, but they never seemed to work or, if they did work, never seemed to last. Tsunade wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up. A part of her thought that maybe it wouldn't be better to just stop. It would hurt him more, but the pain would last for a far shorter period of time and then he wouldn't feel any pain ever again. She felt like an enormous weight was pressing down on her back and every day was growing larger and heavier. It wasn't just that the work was tiring, though it was, or that the sleepless nights devising new strategies and theories were leaving her exhausted. Though they were, it was the psychological effects of failing over and over and over that really seemed to be getting to her. She just felt like she was reaching her limits and she was a little afraid of what would happen when they were exceeded. She might curl up into a little ball and sleep until he was dead, or she might smother him with a pillow to put him out of his misery, or she might slip away in the middle of the night and just go back to drowning herself in alcohol and gambling debts. Not a day went by that she didn't curse Jiraiya for talking her into coming back to the village. A soft knock at the door woke her from her thoughts and saved a mental image of Jiraiya from the horrors of castration and any other torture her mental self could dream up. She rose quietly and walked to the door, opening it just enough to see Haruno Sakura, and then slipping through it so they could speak in the hallway. Sakura was holding a ceramic mug of steaming tea. With a smile, the pink-haired girl handed it over. "How is he?" Tsunade's rose slightly in a small shrug. The answer was obvious anyway. "Jiraiya-sama is supposed to get back today, isn't he?" Sakura asked. "Yes. Do you think?" Sakura paused, suddenly finding her toes very interesting as she twisted them back and forth against the wood floors. "Do you think he found something this time?" Tsunade took a sip of her tea and then turned her eyes on Sakura. The pink-haired girl was getting taller all the time, probably closing in on 160 centimeters now. Her hair was a little longer than it had been when Tsunade had first seen her, and the bald spot had healed and mostly filled in, though it was still noticeably shorter than the rest of her hair, but still remained above her shoulders. She still looked a little funny in the long white shirt that came down to her knees, the uniform of the medic nin working in the hospital, but she was slowly growing into it. When she'd first put it on, she'd looked like a child playing in her mother or father's clothing. Now it almost seemed to suit her. She was very nearly the perfect student for Tsunade, smart, resourceful, and hungry to learn. Were it not for the fact that she was totally loyal to Konoha and a bit more optimistic than was healthy, Tsunade would have been willing to take her when she and Shizune eventually escaped the village. "What do you think he's going to find?" Tsunade asked. Sakura bit her lip and Tsunade could see the war going on behind the young woman's teal-colored eyes. Her natural inclination towards hope clashing with the rationality that Tsunade had instilled within her. "I don't know," she whispered after a moment's hesitation. "Did you read those scrolls one gave you?" Sakura shuddered. "Yes." Tsunade wanted to be firm. She wanted to demand that Sakura say out loud what the scrolls had described Orochimaru doing in his human experiments. She wanted to crush the stupid hope that Sakura, Sasuke, Jiraiya, the Third, and probably Kakashi, though he never spoke on the subject, all seemed to hold onto when it came to Naruto's rescue. Of all of them, Sakura was probably the one most likely to correctly reach the logical conclusion that the best-case scenario for Naruto was that he was buried in a shallow grave somewhere, still mostly recognizable as having once been human. But, looking down at her otherwise intelligent student, she found that she couldn't bring herself to do it. With Jiraiya it was fine, she didn't care about trampling on Sasuke's hopes. The Third was too weak to argue back anyway, and Kakashi was smart enough to keep his feelings to himself, but with Sakura. Tsunade just didn't want Sakura to end up as jaded as she had. The young woman's hope was far-fetched, but Tsunade wouldn't be the one to take it away from her. Life could have that unpleasant job. It was better at it anyway. If he's not ogling girls in some bathhouse he stumbled upon on the way home, he should be back today. Maybe he'll have found what you're hoping for, just don't pin your hopes on it. I don't want you to be too disappointed. Sakura smiled. Of course, sensei. The two of them sat in silence for a few minutes and then Sakura frowned and asked, when I read those scrolls, I was wondering, was Orochimaru always like that? You and Jiraiya-sama are good people. Why did he end up so evil? Tsunade sighed and drained the last of her tea in one quick gulp. He wasn't always like that, but the seeds for it were there. Once upon a time, he was just a gifted ninja who wanted to get stronger and stronger so he could help protect people from the fate that had befallen his parents. Her eyes narrowed as a thought struck her and she almost didn't voice it, but once it had occurred to her, she couldn't push it aside. Sasuke, she said softly, is not so different from how Orochimaru was back then. For a little while, a very little while, I even looked at him the way you look at Sasuke. Sakura recoiled from that thought, as Tsunade knew she would. Sasuke-kun is nothing like that, she hissed. He would never. Tsunade glared at her. Do you think I thought Orochimaru would ever do what he did? When Sakura didn't answer, Tsunade shook her head and turned back to the door to the third's room. Tell Kabuto that I need another sample of the serum we prepared yesterday. Sakura bowed low. Of course, sensei. When she was gone, Tsunade sagged against the closed door and sighed. It hurt her to say something that she knew would hurt Sakura. While there was nothing inherently wrong with liking Sakura and taking her under her wing, it was yet another attachment to the village that she really didn't need or want. Unless Naruto turned up dead and Sasuke was killed in the war, Sakura would never consider leaving Konohagakure, and that meant that it would be a little, not a lot, but a little, harder for Tsunade to bring herself to leave. She stepped inside and resumed her vigil over her dying former mentor. Naruto groaned as he woke from what was probably a drug-induced sleep. Since he was still stuck in total darkness, it was impossible to tell if he'd been out for a day, a month, or only a few seconds. He tired to remember what had led him to that point, but his brain was still fuzzy from whatever they'd given him. The last clear thought that he could remember having was hungrily eating out of a small round tray that had been partially filled with some sort of strange-tasting slop. Once upon a time, he would have spit it out and complained. Now he awkwardly pushed his head into the pan and licked it clean, doing his best not to gag on whatever it was they gave him. It was hard to eat chained up the way he was, but his body was often so desperate for nourishment that he would pull against his shackles until he bled, just to get his mouth at the food. Every once in a while, the guards would set the tray down just out of his reach and then laugh as he struggled and cried as he desperately tried to get at it. During those times, Karen was usually the one to come in, scold the guards, and then lift the food so that Naruto could eat it with as much dignity as a starving man could manage. He loved her whenever she did that. Then he promptly reminded himself to hate her as soon as she was gone, and his mind moved away from thoughts of food and back to his new mission in life: keeping Orochimaru from going after Sasuke again. It was unsettling to realize how easily he was being manipulated by her, but it was difficult to resist. Still, so long as he knew what they were doing, he was fairly certain he could hold out. Giving in to the feeling when she was around was one thing, but he wouldn't tell her anything that would tip Orochimaru off to the fact that there was no secret time travel jutsu. A part of him wondered how much longer such resolve would last. If she suddenly threatened to leave him and never come back unless he told her about the jutsu, would he really be able to give up his only escape from loneliness? For the time being, the answer was yes, but in another few months or years, it was hard to say. Naruto reached up and rubbed his aching neck. It was an involuntary movement and it took a few seconds for him to realize that he'd actually been able to perform it. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't chained down and no one seemed to be attacking him. Hope surged through him, waking tired, weak muscles and filling him with a small burst of energy. They'd slipped up. They'd misjudged how much of the drugs they needed to give him. Naruto closed his eyes, though in the darkness the view was the same, and searched his body. It wasn't a mistake, or not as much of one as he'd thought it had been. He still couldn't feel his chakra, meaning that Hyuga Hiroshi had blocked it off not too long ago. Still, he could move a little, stretch his cramped body, and could prepare himself to attack whoever stepped through the door. He weakly crawled forward away from the wall that he'd woken against, trying to find the door that they would come through when they came for him. Then, he heard a strange whisper in the darkness. Which way is he moving? Naruto froze, his ears alert and his heart racing. He wasn't alone. He stopped. How annoying. Who's there? Naruto whispered hoarsely. His throat was parched and his tongue felt sticky in his mouth. Even if he wanted to, he wasn't sure if he could have raised his voice much above a whisper. He was weak and so tired. He couldn't handle a fight at this point. He was barely handling crawling at the moment. If push came to shove, he thought he could get to his feet and maybe have strength enough in his weary body to put up a decent fight, but it would only be a short burst, nothing more. His energy from realizing that he was unchained had faded and his body wanted nothing more than to collapse onto the dirty ground, but he couldn't do that with an unknown presence in his cell. I don't like his voice, he should stop talking. Here in the dark, there are monsters. I don't want to, but kind of, I do. Naruto groaned silently. It was worse than he'd thought. Being alone in a pitch-black cell with a stranger was bad enough, but now he was in a pitch-black cell with a crazy stranger. It was strange to suddenly find himself in the presence of someone not, to his knowledge, working for Orochimaru. In all the time since he was captured, Naruto had only seen a few people who weren't Orochimaru's servants, and he'd essentially executed those that he had seen. That felt like it had been eons ago, back when he had only been a captive for a few days. Even the nightmares from those days had mostly faded into the recesses of his psyche. Mostly. Are you a captive too? Naruto whispered. I'm Uzumaki Naruto, what's your name? Names don't matter really, the voice replied. Please, stop talking, I don't want to kill you. Naruto accepted this with a nod that he assumed his companion couldn't see and let himself flop down onto the floor of the cell. His whole body ached from having been chained in one position for long periods of time. It hurt to stretch out. It hurt to move. It even hurt to think about moving. He hoped Karen would come see him soon. And then he cursed himself for that hope, knowing what it meant. Some part of his brain was still rational enough to realize that his feelings towards her were manufactured to serve Orochimaru's purposes. She didn't care about him and more than she cared about any other captive. She was just a tool being used to torture him, no different than a knife or a container of boiling oil or even a small child being threatened unless he gave up his secrets. Unfortunately, he thought she might be more effective than all of them put together. Naruto could block out pain, he could suffer through burns, he could even turn away as someone else was killed because he refused to speak, but he couldn't fight loneliness. There were a great many things that he was weak against, but that was probably the most pronounced chink in his armor. I wonder if the lights will come on, the voice whispered, sounding as though it was talking to no one. They never do, Naruto sighed. I said don't talk. The voice was a deafening roar that reverberated off the walls, crashing again and again against Naruto's ears. He grabbed the sides of his head, trying to block it out, but loud noise was such an infrequent experience for him after so long in near total isolation that it was difficult. When the ringing in his ears began to fade, Naruto almost apologized, but thought the better of it. The last thing he needed was more shouting. Coo coo coo, a different voice chuckled from somewhere else in the room. Are you two getting along in there? Orochimaru asked. Neither occupant in the cell answered him. I felt the need for a little entertainment today, Orochimaru went on. Konoha was routed a few days ago by Kumo. It won't be long now before the village falls and I move on to my next project. Please, the voice cried out, begging now. Please, take him away before I don't want to, not again, never again. You've been with me for a long time, and nothing we've tried has cured you. This is a different approach. I've decided to try to slowly wean you off your bloodlust, Orochimaru replied, his voice sounding suspiciously like it was meant to mock them. You've gone several days without killing anyone, much more, and when you finally give in it won't be pretty. A few kills here and there and perhaps you'll start to get used to only giving in to the urges every once in a while. The lights in the room flashed on. They were brighter than any Naruto had seen in weeks, if not months. He screamed, curling up into a little ball and clutching at his eyes, feeling as if the light was burning through them. His companion yelled at him again to be quiet, this time sounding desperate and afraid. Naruto's pain was such that he couldn't even understand what was being said to him for a long time. When he finally was able to block enough of the pain to at least gain some awareness of his surroundings, The only thing he could hear was Orochimaru's chuckling and the sound of a heavy chain being dragged across the dirty floor as footsteps approached him. Sasuke ducked under an outstretched arm, lifting his own to catch the Cloud Nin by the throat and then twisted to the side to bring the man into the path of a sword that was arcing towards them. His human shield cried out briefly and then fell silent as he was nearly cut in half. Turning to face the rest of the group that had ambushed them, Sasuke found himself staring down about 10 Cloud Nin, each already in the process of throwing a kunai or some other projectile. With the swordsman already pulling his blade from his companion that Sasuke had used as a shield and the proximity of those throwing kunai at him, Sasuke realized he was in trouble. At his best, he would be hard-pressed to avoid just the kunai. He wasn't at his best at the moment and the swordsman was beginning his swing. Just then, the Cloud Nin with the sword inexplicably dropped his weapon and dove in front of Sasuke, shielding him from the kunai. He managed to stand tall until the volley had passed and then fell into a limp pile as a long shadow detached itself from his smaller one. Sasuke glanced over his shoulder at where Shikamaru was standing and nodded his thanks. Then he was amongst the remaining Cloud Nin, a blur of motion as his sword and fists made quick work of them before they could recover from their surprise. When the last of them fell, he and Shikamaru looked like they had a clear shot at Yugito. The blonde was still standing in the same spot, her dark strangely slanted eyes looking up at the sky expectantly. "Are you ready?" Sasuke asked as he and Shikamaru rushed towards her. "Not really," Shikamaru admitted. Sasuke's fingers began flashing through seals and then lightning exploded into existence around his right hand as a sound reminiscent of a great flock of birds filled the air. Without needing any more signal than that, Shikamaru jumped out of the way, his own fingers coming together even before he landed and his shadow snaking out. Though it was doubtful he could hold her for long or do anything more than cause her to hesitate when she first realized what was happening, his first target was Yugito. The instant before Shikamaru's shadow could latch onto hers, she skipped back a step and then flipped backwards high into the air. Sasuke adjusted his headlong flight so that he would meet her right as she touched down. There was a loud shout off to his left and out of the corner of his eye he spotted 2 large Cloud Nin bearing down on him, their hands together as they formed seals. His brain quickly calculated his chances of getting to Yugito before they did finish the jutsu and realized that he couldn't continue his attack without leaving himself open to their attacks. His charge faltered for a brief second as he readied himself to attack the 2 other Cloud Nin first, but before he could a large dark shape flashed past him as another leapt from atop a building. "Sweden. Mizuame Nabara," Kamizuki Izumo called out as sticky syrup spewed from his mouth, coating the ground around the 2 Cloud Nin. They looked down in surprise, taking their eyes off of Sasuke, and then Hagane Kotetsu was upon them, his dark spiky hair blown back by the speed of his movements and an enormous lavender conch shell mace already raised above his head. Sasuke had always thought the flashy mace to be ridiculously impractical, but it was hard to argue with results. It only took one strike to kill both ninja as Kotetsu's leap carried him to the other side of the syrup. Neither of the recently promoted Junin paused to congratulate themselves as they turned and began moving to back up Sasuke, who had already turned his attention back towards Yugito. Unfortunately, Sasuke's momentary hesitation gave her enough time to reach the ground before he got to her. His lightning-covered fist flew forward, aimed right at her heart, but even as he did so, something unexpected began to happen. Yugito didn't move, nor did his eyes predict her moving, but a strange blue chakra sprang up around her and pushed his arm just enough to the side that he missed her and his fist slammed into the wooden wall of the house she was standing in front of. The Chidori exploded, showering both of them with splinters as almost half the wall was destroyed. The sudden loss of support beams was more than the building could take and it creaked, groaned, and then toppled towards the 2 of them. Sasuke and Yugito leapt out of the way, barely escaping the debris that rained down on them. As he rolled smoothly to his feet, Sasuke let out a soft curse. He'd never fought Yugito and didn't actually know anyone who had, but he'd heard the stories. His best bet had been to take her out with that first strike. He'd never heard of anyone other than a Hyuga blocking an attack with chakra alone, and even they had to make a physical movement to push the chakra in the right direction. Yugito hadn't done anything like that. His eyes would have seen and predicted the full range of her movement before her body had done anything more than twitch. What was worse, now that he'd missed his first attack, they would be on more or less even footing. From what he knew of those that had fought and been killed by her as well as the stories he'd heard of her abilities, being on even footing with her meant that he was probably about to lose. Yugito was just as quick to her feet, maybe quicker, and no sooner was she up than she had already begun to launch into her attacks. Sasuke nimbly slid away from 3 punches and then a kick that nearly took his head off as it whistled past his ear. He blocked her next punch and was driven to his knees under the force of the blow. He'd never experienced such a heavy strike, and was caught off guard by the fact that she didn't seem to be the sort of woman who could produce such power. He rolled to the side before she could press her advantage and had his fingers around a kunai before he'd even completed the movement. As his arm moved forward, she began to spin away. His Sharingan caught her movement and predicted where she'd end up when it was completed. His grip tightened on the kunai, keeping it in his hand for a split second longer as he readjusted his aim. The kunai's new path would take it right through the spot where the bridge of her nose would end up. Given the close range, Yugito's reaction time was incredibly impressive. She spotted the danger and began to arch her back, trying to bring her head out of the way. She was too late, however, his eyes had already seen that she wouldn't be able to move in time. He'd won. Then, just as with the Chidori, blue chakra appeared from nowhere and deflected the kunai off target enough for her to escape. Sasuke cursed as he reached for his sword and charged towards her. She was so fast and that strange jutsu she was using was so unpredictable even his Sharingan couldn't seem to give him enough information for him to finish her off. Using the sword at close range would lessen his foresight advantage since the time between the image his eyes showed him and her actual movements would be shorter, but her reactions were too quick for any long-range attacks anyway. The two of them danced throughout the middle of the burning town. The sulfurous ash burned at their eyes and lungs, but neither slowed or let it affect them. Sasuke's sword flashed back and forth, trying to connect solidly, but always just a heartbeat too slow to do anything more than small scratches. Yugito drew a kunai to protect herself and to attack as well, but she too found it almost impossible to do anything more than land superficial scratches. Behind, Shikamaru yelled from where he was dealing with 4 cloud nen who had tried to sneak up on Sasuke earlier. Sasuke didn't hesitate. His flipped high into the air just as 3 kunai sizzling with stored lightning passed through the spot where he'd been. For a second, he hoped that Yugito would be caught by the attacks, but she ducked under them and then sprang forward. Sasuke didn't need his Sharingan to tell him that she was aiming for the spot where he was going to land. He twisted in the air, positioned his sword so that it would be ready to defend the attack. He could already see her starting to prepare, and then braced himself. The clash of metal sounded like that of a bell and the sword vibrated in Sasuke's hand with such violence that he couldn't keep his grip on it. Yugito lost her kunai as well. The sting of the vibrations and the loss of their weapons barely slowed either of them down. Sasuke ducked low under a punch, kicking his leg out to trip her up. She was too fast for something like that, however, but he saw which direction she was going to take before she'd even moved. His hands blurred through the proper seals, stopping on Tiger and then moving towards his mouth as he sucked in a deep breath. A great fireball erupted from his mouth and consumed Yugito just as she lifted her hands to protect herself. Sasuke let out a sigh of relief as he watched the fiery form slam into the side of a building. It had been a far closer thing than he'd wanted it to be, but with her out of the way. "Look out!" Azuma yelled as he tackled Sasuke just as what looked like a blue flame shot out of the fireball and slammed into the ground where Sasuke had been sitting. The 2-leaf nin tumbled through the soot-covered street, but then quickly got to their feet. "She won't be that easy," Azuma said as he pulled a large kunai-shaped weapon that was nearly as long as a sword off his back. He wet his lips nervously and said, "She has a strange ability to control chakra. I've never seen anything like it." "I've noticed," Sasuke replied. "My eyes can't predict it. There's no warning before it happens." Azuma pulled the bandana Hite-8 off his head and brushed the brown hair that normally hid his right eye out of his face, pushing it back and then pulling the Hite-8 back on. "I'll need 2 eyes for this, I think," he said with a small smile. Sasuke watched as Yugito dropped to the ground. The lavender-colored leather armor that covered most of her torso was singed and the black shirt that she wore under it was almost completely burned away, but her body didn't seem to have taken much damage. "Any ideas?" Azuma asked, his dark eyes tracking Yugito's every movement. "Stay back," Sasuke replied. I can follow her movements pretty well. If you see a chance, feel free to lend a hand, just don't kill me when you do it." He paused and then added, "Also, use some water jutsu on her. If you can get her wet and distracted, maybe I can send a current through it." It's simple, but she might not expect something like that. Azumo outranked Sasuke, was older and more experienced, but Sasuke was an Uchiha, and even after so many years, that still meant something. Besides, Sasuke was right. His eyes did allow him to follow Yugito's movements better than probably anyone else, certainly better than any of the other three-leaf nin in the immediate area. The older ninja nodded and whispered, "Good luck." Sasuke charged forward, his fingers forming seals once more. As soon as he was close enough, he sent another fireball at Yugito, this time flicking 3 kunai into it the moment that the flames had obscured her vision of him. Even if she could somehow block the flames or survive them, even she couldn't block kunai when she didn't see them coming. Yugito didn't let the flames reach her this time. She flipped high into the air, and sent her own hail of kunai down at Sasuke, who nimbly avoided them as he moved ever closer to her. Sasuke's hands come together, forming seals, and then a second Sasuke appeared out of a cloud of smoke. The two split apart, each angling towards her from opposite directions. Now, both Sasukes yelled. Azumo reared back and then spit a great spout of water at Yugito. With the two Sasukes so close, she didn't dare leave the ground or try to dodge, so she simply thrust her fist forward, flames seeming to appear around her hand, and the waters parted before her in a great cloud of steam. Even then, she'd gotten wet, and that was most of what Sasuke had hoped for. One of him formed a series of seals and another Chidori appeared around his hand, while the other simply drew a kunai and picked up speed. Yugito had to choose which of him to face and which to try to simply avoid. She decided that the Chidori-wielding Sasuke was the most dangerous and turned towards him, just as he'd known she would. At the last second, he pushed off the ground, flipping high into the air as the second Sasuke continued forward. Yugito didn't even look back as she threw her foot back and caught him in the face. The clone exploded like a bolt of lightning. Yugito screamed as the blast from the lightning clone threw her into the air and sent her slamming to the ground. Sasuke had mapped it out perfectly. He landed in a crouch, his feet on either side of her and his body held just above her, the Chidori still crackling in his palm. His hand flashed down towards her heart. Before it got there, however, her dark eyes snapped open and her pupils became vertical slits as her irises suddenly turned to gold. She let out a horrible scream as her hair stood on end and a burst of chakra sent Sasuke flying away from her. He landed in a heap and looked up in dismay as Yugito was covered in blue flames that quickly took the form of a giant two-tailed cat. At that moment, he understood why so few walked away from battles she participated in. Jiraiya sighed as he looked up at the large wooden gates and waited to be allowed through. It had been a long couple of weeks filled with irritation and disappointment. Though he'd figured it would be just his luck to take the clue that led to the dead end, it was still disappointing to have not found Orochimaru or Naruto. He had found a base, one that was actually in use this time, but Orochimaru and Naruto hadn't been there. He'd checked under every rock and unconscious body and corpse, most of which he'd had a hand in strewing about, just to be sure. The guards hadn't been much help either. After they set prisoners, ninja who had volunteered for experiments, and everyone else staying there, the guards had fought and made threats and then ran away, forcing him to chase them down, and in the end they hadn't even known anything about Orochimaru's current location or what had happened to Naruto. Jiraiya let out another sigh. He supposed he was glad to be back even if he wasn't coming to recruit a rescue party that had a confirmed destination. He could still round up a few to help him, Temari and her brothers. With any luck, Kakashi and Sasuke would be around. They, for sure, would come with him. As he waited, he studied the walls around the village and the guards carefully. The war was beginning to take its toll on Konoha, robbing it of the pleasantness he normally associated with returning to it. With the third dying, or dead, though he was certain he would have heard about it if that had happened, and who knew how many leaf nin being killed every day on the battlefield, there was something of an aura of gloom hanging over the village. Konoha looked exactly as it had when he left, but something still felt off about it. A part of him wondered how long it would be before attacks began to reach the village itself. He'd heard a rumor that the Cloud Nin were starting to get close. Probably it wouldn't be much more than a few weeks, though if things went particularly badly, it could be a matter of days. If it happened before Tamari and her brothers sent word that they'd found Orochimaru's base, Jiraiya would have to make a tough decision. It was one thing to say that he didn't care about the village when it wasn't in any immediate danger, but he wasn't so sure he could turn his back on his former home when an invasion force was laying siege to it. He gave himself a little shake and turned his thoughts to other matters. How many steps do I get into the village before Sasuke finds me? He wondered to himself. Had Tsunade been standing there with him, he probably would have turned it into a bet. Jiraiya supposed he couldn't fault the boy for wanting to save his friend. If Naruto had survived the last 2 years, he might be cheered to know how much he was missed. Still, he hoped he wouldn't run into the Uchiha boy. It wasn't that he really disliked Sasuke, but Jiraiya couldn't seem to shake the nagging thought that Sasuke would have betrayed Naruto and left the village by this point if things had not taken their strange turn. It wasn't very fair to hold something he hadn't even done against him, but the Sasuke Naruto described sounded very similar to Orochimaru before he left the village, and Jiraiya was inherently distrustful of people he thought bore any resemblance to his old teammate. The gate in front of him opened with a creak, and the Chunin, who looked like he was only a Chunin because those who were really Chunin were out fighting the war, guarding it, gave him a respectful nod as he passed by. "Hokage-sama is waiting for you in his room," the guard told him. Jiraiya frowned, wanting to ask how the old man was, but knowing that it was unlikely that a gate guard who was barely old enough to shave would have such information. He was actually surprised that there were even orders from Sarutobi at all. He knew no one had seen the third in weeks when he left. He doubted things would have changed much since then. After only a second, he realized what had probably happened. Tsunade had issued the order, claiming it was from the third. Jiraiya had told her to try to make it seem as if Sarutobi was on the mend a few months earlier. This was probably one of her attempts to do so. Orders from the desk of the Hokage were the way that most ninja interacted with him anyway, since he would be hard-pressed to meet with every one of them. He tended to directly give missions to the younger ninja, since it let them feel connected to the process and gave them a chance to see how proud he was of them when they completed their assignments. But the older ninja usually just received missions through messengers or through their team leaders. Tsunade was as shrewd as ever, it seemed. "I'd have thought he'd at least let me get a drink before the interrogation started," Jiraiya grumbled, figuring he might as well play up his part, and he really did want a drink. "I was told to inform you that Tsunade-sama will be bringing sake and that you are to go directly to meet her at Hokage-sama's quarters as well." He gulped and then whispered, "Or else." Jiraiya smiled. Who would have guessed that such a violent, flat-chested girl would grow up to be so considerate? The Chunin decided, probably wisely, not to respond with anything more than an awkward smile and a look that suggested he really wished Jiraiya would get going. Jiraiya took a deep breath and started the march, counting his steps to see how far he'd get before Sasuke was on him. He wasn't really looking forward to the conversation with Tsunade and Sarutobi, though he'd already sent a note explaining most of what had happened. What he really wasn't looking forward to was seeing how much farther the third had deteriorated while he was gone. Chances were, the council would be almost ready to usurp power from him and take official control of the village or simply appoint another Hokage. Jiraiya wasn't sure that he completely disagreed with them. A dying Hokage was terrible for morale, and the third was insistent upon one of his remaining students taking the job despite their unwavering refusals. Jiraiya was actually rather impressed when he made it all the way to Hokage Tower without running into Sasuke, though it was likely that the young man was still out on some mission. He thought he'd been told that Sasuke's group was due back for a few days of rest at about this time, but he didn't pay enough attention to such things to be certain of that. Whatever the reason, he reached the door to the third Hokage's room without having to say so much as, "hello," to anyone other than a few guards. Bracing himself for the worst, he knocked softly and then entered. Tsunade was waiting for him just inside the room. Her eyes were bloodshot and the bags under them looked to be nearly as heavy as her breasts. "Well," he almost smiled, "not really." "You're late," she whispered. "It's hard to estimate travel time when I have to make my way through 2 war zones," he replied. "How is he?" "Worse. I thought you said?" "I know what I said." Tsunade snapped, wincing at the unintentional volume of her voice. Jiraiya heard her words. It was impossible to miss them, but more than that, he could hear her pain and desperation. He hadn't thought she was joking, but it was clear that she wasn't overstating things either. In fact, worse, was probably downplaying how bad it was. It's worse than it was before you left. Whatever it is, I'm having more and more trouble slowing it down. I think," she sighed and squeezed the bridge of her nose. "I think we've reached a tipping point. I don't know if I can pull him back from it. At this rate, it could be days, maybe a week." Jiraiya cursed under his breath. "We can't wait any longer. One of us has to take the title. If we don't, one of them will get it." He didn't need to tell her which them he was referring to. "Let them have it," Tsunade growled with a dismissive wave of her hand. They were all decent ninja at one point and most of them have been working in village politics for years. "That's why they shouldn't be Hokage," Jiraiya replied. "In the council it's too easy to play politics and make a bigger name for themselves than they deserve. The Hokage isn't supposed to be a politician. Not like that, anyway. Besides, you know who they'll give it to." Danzo, Tsunade spat the name like a curse. "They couldn't really be that stupid, could they? We're in the middle of a war. They're scared and there's a power vacuum at the highest position. They'll give it to whoever bullies his way into the job. It'll be him." "You said we're," Tsunade whispered. "I thought you and I weren't a part of the village anymore." Jiraiya snorted. "If Danzo becomes Hokage, this village won't be the home we remember anyway. Then stop him. Take the title and keep him out of it." Jiraiya lowered his head. "If I do that, Naruto." Tsunade slapped him hard across the face. The slap echoed through the darkness of the room, seeming to drown out even the beeping of the machines and the rasping breathing of the other occupant. "You were right, you'd make a terrible Hokage." Tsunade hissed. "Naruto, Naruto, Naruto, that's all you think about. This village needs you and you're worried about one kid who might have died 2 years ago." Jiraiya slowly brought his face back around, his left cheek already turning red from the blow. His eyes seemed to blaze like twin fires in the darkness as he drew himself up to his full height, towering over her. "He is more important to me than this village," he growled in a low threatening voice. "Naruto isn't just some kid, he's the future Hokage. He's Minato and Kushina's son. He's my godson. I loved this village, but when it came down to it, I left and didn't look back. I won't turn my back on him." Tsunade stared defiantly up at him, not backing down. "You're lying. You talk about loving the village in the past tense, but you lie when you do it. You've always loved this village, maybe even more than I did when we were little." She waited for a moment, and then, when Jiraiya didn't respond, she asked, "How can he be the future Hokage if the spirit of the village is lost when someone like Danzo takes over? Who will follow Naruto when Danzo turns everyone into a bunch of emotionless drones like those Root kids were?" They held each other's gaze for a second longer, each face twisted in anger, and then Jiraiya blinked and deflated, just a little. She was, after all, right. He did love the village, much as he hated to admit it. And besides, what would it mean if he saved Naruto and brought him back to a village that was no longer his home? He hadn't had time to really get to know Naruto, but what he did know, what he imagined he knew, told him that Naruto would want Konoha protected above all else. Just as his father would have. Jiraiya deflated more, his head dropping until his gray hair covered his face. Naruto had told him that Tsunade was supposed to be the next Hokage. It was a job that they both agreed she'd been born for. Related to the first two, taught by the third, she couldn't be more perfectly groomed for the position. But things were different from how Naruto remembered them. Whether it was the real reason or not, this Tsunade had never met Naruto and hadn't been offered the job after the third's death. Perhaps that was all it took to completely change her willingness to take the title, or perhaps some other events were needed to convince her. Whatever the cause, it was too late. Naruto wasn't around and Tsunade had been forced to watch as the third slowly slipped away despite her best efforts, another man she'd loved dying on her watch. This wasn't something that could be fixed, not by him anyway. Without a word to Tsunade, Jiraiya crossed the room and knelt next to the bed, taking Sarutobi's cold, frail hand in his own. He gave the hand a gentle squeeze and waited until the third Hokage opened his eyes. "I'll do it," he whispered. Meat sizzled and popped, its sticky aroma filling the area as it cooked on a thin piece of slate that sat in the midst of a fire tucked away in the jagged clusters of rocks that dotted the arid region north of Iwagakure. A tall fat man hummed to himself as his greasy hands crushed a few scraggly herbs that he'd found growing in the shadow of a nearby boulder and sprinkled them over the meat before reaching down and flipped the meat over, smiling at the sight of one well-cooked side already finished. He reached for the swollen pouch that hung around his hip and popped the lid off of it, taking a long swig of the alcohol contained within, not minding the excess that spilled from his lips and ran down his dirty shirt. With a satisfied sigh, he poured a bit of it over the meat for some added flavoring. The fire roared when the alcohol rolled off the slate and into the pit, but quickly died back down. A gentle crunching of rock alerted him to the intruder the moment before a dark-haired boy stepped out from behind one of the nearby rocks. The man was instantly on guard, and he reached back and drew a long sword with a serrated edge out of the sheath on his back. "What do you want?" he growled at the newcomer. "Are you Sango, the one called the Shunshin? Who's askin'?" The boy tried to smile pleasantly, but his face didn't seem to be used to the movements. "I used to be called Gara of the Sand. Never heard of ya. Go away." Gara didn't move. "I want information, and you think I have it?" Sango snorted. "You're starting to annoy me, brat. That ain't smart. I've been told you might know where Orochimaru has been keeping himself." "What would I want with one of the Sannin?" Sango demanded, suddenly feeling more agitated than before. At his feet, the stench of burning meat rose up and filled his nostrils, but he didn't care. Mentioning Orochimaru suddenly made an irritating conversation far more serious. "And even if I did know where he was, what makes you think I'd tell a little pipsqueak like you?" The young man's eyes narrowed. "I've met plenty of people like you. You'd sell your soul to save your own life." There was no threat in his tone, but his calm words were enough. Sango had grown tired of talking and wanted Gara gone. He advanced on the younger man, twirling the sword expertly. "I don't know who you were and I don't care, you just bought yourself a world of hurt." When he was less than a meter away from the newcomer, he suddenly seemed to vanish, reappearing behind the boy a half-second later. "See you in hell." The sword flashed through the air, slicing perfectly towards the young man's neck, but it never reached its target. Sand sprang up around the boy, catching the sword and then yanking it from its owner's hands. The dark-haired boy glanced over his shoulder and almost seemed to smile. "I'm pretty sure I know what hell looks like," he said softly. "I won't be going back." Sango's eyes widened. He didn't know who he was facing, but for his opponent to be fast enough to block an attack that had killed dozens of ninja twice his age, he had to be good. To anyone watching, he seemed to vanish. He fled so fast, reappearing on a rocky ledge several meters away. He glanced over his shoulder to see if he was being followed and was relieved to see that the boy was still standing in the same spot. Whoever he was, he seemed to have no trouble following Sango's movements because he was looking right at him. Still, following movement and keeping up with it were two very different things. Sango smiled and leapt to the top of a nearby boulder. Sand shot up from the ground and snagged him out of midair. Sango screamed in terror as he was completely cocooned before he could even think about struggling. Gara stood with his arm outstretched, hand flexed as if preparing to make a fist. His dark ringed eyes seemed to cloud over for a second, but then he blinked and turned his hand, letting it relax as the sand slowly dragged its captive over to him. When it reached him, the sand around the top shifted, exposing Sango's head as he let out a loud gasp and greedily sucked in air. "Where is Orochimaru?" Gara asked. "I don't know." The sand began to creep up his neck, ready to swallow him once more. "I don't know." Sango cried out again, his eyes wide and panicked. "I don't believe you," Gara told him calmly. The sand was sliding up into his hair and inching its way along his jawline. "It is difficult not to kill you," Gara whispered. "The monster inside me doesn't get to eat as much as it used to. Either tell me where Orochimaru is, or convince me that you don't know, but do it quickly, for both our sakes." "Look, I've met him, okay?" Sango said, his lips quivering and slurring his words as they rushed out of his mouth. "Just a few days ago, he came to me for information on a town near here and some other stuff. That's all, I swear." Gara stared at him long and hard, contemplating whether the man was telling the truth or not. Then he closed his eyes and let out a slow, shuddering breath. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't believe you and I can't hold out any longer. If you have family, please tell me so I can return what's left of your body after I'm done with it." The sand swirled up, completely enveloping everything but Sango's mouth. "Wait," he screamed. "Wait, I know something more. I've been to one of his bases. Please." The sand pulled back all the way down to the top of the man's neck. "Where?" Gara demanded. "Just a few kilometers to the northeast. There are 4 small hills with a valley full of rock stacks between them. He's got a base in the second most northern hill." It's a cave with a pretty small entrance, kind of hidden behind some brush. Gaara stared at him. That's all I know, I swear. I delivered some stuff there. I didn't get to go in, but I was close enough that I could see where they came out of when I got there. You're coming with us, Gaara said slowly. If you're lying, there won't be enough of you left for your family to identify. Two more people stepped into view. One was a tall girl with blonde hair that hung around her shoulders wearing a modest, gray dress that came down to her knees and large, black object strapped to her back. The other was another boy. His hair was red and he too had something strapped to his back, though it was hard to be sure what it was since white sheets of cloth were wrapped around it. It was definitely not the same thing the girl was carrying. Sango Shunshin, the new boy, laughed mockingly, shaking his head. What a joke. I've seen slugs that move faster. Sango glared at him, but said nothing as they dragged him along on their way to the base that he'd told them about. He wasn't sure what they wanted with Orochimaru, but trapped in the sand as he was completely at their mercy. It would be better to keep his mouth shut and hope they didn't decide to kill him once they'd confirmed the information they wanted. After observing the base for a few minutes, Gaara, Temari, and Kankuro retreated to safe distance, the sand dragging Sango along, and sat down to discuss their options. They would have to return to a nearby town and send a message to Jiraiya. That much was obvious, but what to do with Sango was not. We can't just let him walk, Kankuro argued. If he tells Orochimaru or anyone else for that matter, we're dead. Someone like Orochimaru will have spies all over the place. We might have been identified already. Shunshin-san blabbing about what we're looking for will bring him and everyone in that base down on us in a heartbeat. Temari nodded. I agree. We can't let him go, it's too dangerous. He didn't do anything wrong, Gaara pointed out softly. We don't have to kill him. Would you rather just let him stay with us? Kankuro asked, crossing his arms across his chest. The stench is bad enough, but what if he calls for help or something and someone hears him? Temari bit her lip. Gaara, this wouldn't be like before, she said gently. You won't be killing him for fun or just to prove that you can. He's a liability, one that we can't afford, but, if you'd prefer, Kankuro or I can do it. Gaara was quiet for a moment, but then shook his head. No, I can do it quicker and cleaner. I'll take care of it. Sango's eyes widened as Gaara approached the cocoon of sand he was still trapped within. Please, he whispered, I won't talk, I promise. Gaara looked at him, his face sad, but something darker behind his eyes. I'm sorry. Sango never even finished the word. The sand covered him and then tightened so quickly that he was dead before he felt a thing or even realized what was about to happen. Gaara watched as the sands fell away from the remains and then made its way back into the gourd on his back, carrying Sango Shunshin's blood with it. He looked down at his hand and noticed it trembling, but wasn't sure if it was excitement from the blood or fear of sliding back into what he'd been. He let his head fall back and stared up at the sky. It's not the same, he whispered. Sasuke stared up at the awesome sight of the enormous cat and backed away as quickly as he could. The chakra radiating from Yugito was incredible, but the killer intent was like nothing he'd ever felt. Yugito, if it was indeed still her, turned her glowing yellow eyes upon him and hissed. A blast of hot air hit Sasuke in the chest and nearly lifted him off the ground. She opened her mouth and a ball of flame began to form within it. Shit, Sasuke turned to flee, knowing that chances were against him getting out of the blast radius of something so large and powerful. A heavy stream of water struck Yugito in the face, but did nothing to douse the flame in her mouth. Sasuke looked up to see Izumo standing only a few meters away, the water jutsu spewing from his mouth. An idea struck Sasuke. If he could stand just a little in front of Izumo and cast a lightning jutsu into the stream of water just as Izumo broke it off and leapt away, the water would guide his attack right into Yugito's mouth. Surely something like that would be enough to at least distract her while they got away, wouldn't it? He turned to Izumo and was about to speak his plan when suddenly Yugito threw her hand, or paw, in this case, forward, stretching it farther than it seemed like it should go. Izumo didn't even have time to look surprised before one of Yugito's claws sunk into his chest with a great spurt of gore. The water from his mouth faded and then stopped as the clawed hand lifted his body up and then with a casual flick of her wrist, she slammed him into the ground. Sasuke stared in horror at the sight for a second that seemed to drag on for an eternity and then he dove out of the way as a clawed hand sought to give him a similar end. Shikamaru. Katetsu, fall back, Sasuke yelled as he leapt away from another swipe of Yugito's claws. Sasuke could see her attacks, but his Sharingan couldn't predict them. The chakra seemed to act without thought or without warning. There was no build-up to the action, only the action itself, swift and deadly. A third strike came at him, and this time he was too slow. The claws raked across his chest, cutting open his flak jacket and splattering his blood on dirty ground. Sasuke stumbled back and almost fell into a pile of boxes that were more ash than wood by that point. He looked down at himself and groaned. The cuts were only flesh wounds, but they were deep, bloody flesh wounds. He was exhausted and he was losing blood rapidly. Yugito was going to win. The enormous cat looked down at him and almost seemed to smile. She let out a screaming howl that chilled him to his bones. But not as much as what he saw next did. Izumo slowly began to pick himself up off the ground, blood still pouring out of the hole in his chest that should have removed both his lungs and probably at least part of his heart. There was no way he was still alive, but that didn't seem to be stopping him as he picked up his large kunai and spun it expertly in his hands. Without warning, he rushed at Sasuke, weapon streaking through the air. Sasuke twisted to the side and then threw himself backwards to avoid the follow-up strike. Just as he hit the ground, his eyes caught a hint of movement coming at him from the side. He rolled away as Yugito's claws sunk into the ground where he'd been. Izumo didn't slow his attack for a second. Sasuke quickly got to his feet and took off running as fast as he could towards the spot where his sword was lying on the ground. He had to dive over Yugito's claws to get it, but when he was back on his feet, he was armed once more. Izumo's kunai crashed into Sasuke's sword with impressive strength, but the deceased Leaf Nin was flat-footed and Sasuke twisted away and slashed backwards with his sword, cutting deeply into Izumo's back. Izumo turned towards him as if the blow hadn't even landed and attacked once more. Sasuke's next strike was aimed to do far more damage, cutting Izumo's hand off at the wrist and knocking the weapon away from him. Izumo ignored the wound and simply grabbed at him. Sasuke tried to twist away, but the dead Junin's hand held tight, keeping him from escaping. It wasn't hard to guess what was coming next. Sasuke looked over his shoulder and saw the blue cat open its mouth as the ball of fire swirled within it. With the last of his strength, Sasuke spun Izumo's body in between himself and the blast. It wouldn't be much, but perhaps it would give him a little protection. He closed his eyes and whispered an apology to Sakura and Naruto. "Hold tight, Sasuke, I've got you," Kakashi's voice whispered in his ear just before the explosion went off. Sasuke felt the flash of heat, the burning of his skin, and then he knew no more. Two figures in dark cloaks made their way slowly through the wind-swept desert in near silence. Looking back, it seemed that their tracks extended all the way to the horizon, though in truth they hadn't been walking quite that far. It did, however, seem like it to one of them. "Are you sure he's here, him?" one of the men asked the other. "We've been looking for a long time. If this is another dead end." "Shut your mouth, Deidara," the larger of the two growled. "My sources are certain this time." "Yeah, I've heard that before, Deidara grumbled. "Sometimes your sources are full of shit, Sasori." "Wait and see," Sasori growled back. "Orochimaru is very close. It won't be long now." Hinata sipped her tea and leaned back against one of the posts holding up the awning that covered the walkway around her family's inner courtyard and sighed as she looked at the pretty tree in the center of the open area. She closed her eyes and enjoying the warmth of the morning sun on her face as it rose just high enough to peek at her over the top of the roof. It was hard to believe that just a few days earlier she'd been on a mission with Kiba, Akamaru, and Shino in which they'd had to fight their way past an ambush that had nearly taken their lives. Her body still ached from the beating it had taken during the fighting, and if she twisted her torso too much to the right, a large scab from a burn she'd received would crack open and bleed all over yet another shirt, her second in the still young day. Fortunately, sitting and sipping tea while enjoying the sunshine and peace of the moment didn't require her to twist in any direction, so her shirt was safe for the moment. The tree in the middle of the courtyard was beginning to bud in the springtime warmth. It wouldn't be too long before they'd have pretty sakura petals gently falling to the ground like snowflakes. Hinata smiled at the thought, as she always did when this time of year rolled around, and then wiped away a tear that had appeared in her eye. The tree had been planted shortly after her mother had died. It was a sort of memorial to her as well as a sign to those in mourning that their outward sadness was to be buried. They were Hyuga, after all, and that meant that they had to be constantly in control of their emotions, always projecting a sense of strength. Hanabi had been only a newborn, too young to understand or be held accountable for her actions. She'd cried when the tree that had been there before was pulled free and crashed to the ground, waking her from the almost continuous nap that babies took those first few days. Hinata had cried as well, but there hadn't been as much forgiveness for her weakness. She didn't think that they completely held it against her. She was only 5 at the time, but no doubt it was just one more thing that lowered her stock in the eyes of those around her. Looking back on it now, it didn't seem to her that a child's overwhelming grief over a beloved mother was a fair thing to hold against her. A slight breeze rustled through the leaves of the tree, drawing Hinata's attention away from the past. For the past few months, whenever she looked at the tree, she considered planting a tree for Naruto. According to her father, Naruto's status was somewhat up in the air, though neither of the proposed options were very appealing. In the eyes of the village government, he was either dead or a missing nin that should be killed on sight. Hinata knew Naruto wasn't a missing nin. She doubted anyone other than the Hokage loved the village as much as Naruto did, but she wasn't so sure about whether or not he was dead. She wanted to believe that he was alive. Really wanted to believe. But after so much time, it was hard to hold out hope. Perhaps, if she planted a tree for him, it would be easier to let go. Then she could go and visit it and think back on the time she'd been able to enjoy with him. During the spring, it would blossom and she would think about how incredible he'd been during the Chunin exam when he'd showed everyone that he was not the dead last that they thought him to be. In the fall, the leaves would turn pretty colors and she would think about climbing trees and training with him. It would be nice, but it was too early. Almost 2 years was not nearly long enough to give up hope and allow herself to completely move on. Planting a tree would just be too final. 3 years was better. At that point, it would be very unlikely that he would ever come back. Of course, 4 years was a nice round number and that made more sense. Though 5 was half a decade. That probably would be enough time, and the words, half a decade, seemed very final sounding. Yes, 5 years was better than 4. Blood pooled in Naruto's mouth, rolled slowly over his teeth and then dribbled down his chest and onto the floor. For a moment, he remained where he was, held up not by his own muscles, but by the force of the blow that had actually sunk him a few centimeters into the wall. He wished he was dead. Across the room, his cellmate, a young man not much older than himself named Jugo, was being dragged back towards the far wall by the chains wrapped around his body. It was hard for Naruto to focus on it with the ringing in his ears. But Jugo was probably alternating between demanding to be allowed to kill Naruto and begging to be taken away so that he wouldn't kill Naruto, as he always did whenever he'd been pulled away during their past few hours or days or months as cellmates. It was hard to be sure how much time had passed. Everything seems to blend together when you're getting beaten to a pulp. The strange physical transformations that Jugo went through, seemingly at will, were still slowly fading, giving him a lopsided appearance with one arm so much larger than the other. Naruto's body began to roll forward, tipping him dangerously off balance, but he lacked the strength to stop the fall. His head hit the hard floor with a loud crack as stars exploded in front of his eyes. Somewhere, far away it seemed, a heavy metal door slid open and footsteps scuffed across the floor. A powerful hand wound its way through Naruto's long hair and then yanked sharply, dragging him into a kneeling position. The light streaming through the door to the cell was bright enough to agitate Naruto's eyes, but a little watering was nothing compared to the trouble that was glaring at him. "What do you have to say for yourself today, Naruto-kun?" Orochimaru asked. Naruto looked at him for a moment, wishing he didn't feel the fear that was clenching his gut, and then let his eyes drift away. He let out a hard sigh, spraying the blood from his mouth into Orochimaru's face. "Still aren't feeling talkative, are you? That's all right." Orochimaru glanced over at the older prisoner and smiled. Jugo doesn't tire as easily as some. He pushed Naruto aside, sending the blonde tumbling to the ground, panting and unable to move. For a moment, Orochimaru stared down at Naruto and then, with an almost sad shake of his head, he said, "The third Hokage is dying, have I told you that?" He had. "It won't be long, from what I hear." A pity. The old man deserved to go out fighting, giving his life for something he believed in, not lying in a bed struggling to breathe. "You and your jutsu robbed him of some of his glory." Orochimaru waited for Naruto to respond, and when he didn't, He added, how many others will suffer the same fate? That comment caused Naruto to flinch. Not much, but enough that it was noticeable. Perhaps the problem we're having is that you don't really care about yourself, Orochimaru mused. Maybe you're the wrong person for me to be torturing for information. I wonder if you would be so willing to let another suffer because you refuse to speak. Naruto turned his head just enough so that he could glare up at his hated enemy between the long, greasy locks of blonde hair hanging down in his face. Orochimaru chuckled. Oh, that's right. I'd nearly forgotten that we already tried that. You didn't seem to care about them either. He knelt next to Naruto, ignoring the glare he was receiving, and said, I'm going to let you think about this for a while. I'm growing impatient. We both know that your body can't keep this up forever. To that end, I'm going to do what I need to in order to get you to start talking. Up until now, I've been lenient on you, but that's coming to an end. The next time I open that door, I'm going to have someone important to you with me. Maybe it will be that little pink-haired girl, Sakura, or perhaps the Hyuga heiress, or maybe the third's grandson. I doubt it really matters which I get a hold of. Whoever it is, I'm going to spend days killing them right in front of you, making sure they know that you could end their suffering with just a few short words. A tremble of fear and impotent rage coursed through Naruto's body. He tried to get up to do something, anything, but Orochimaru brought his hand down on Naruto's back and slammed him back down to the ground before he rose more than a few centimeters. Ku. Think about it, Naruto-kun. I'll be expecting a good answer when we see each other next time. He rose and glanced over his shoulder towards the doorway. Clean him up, he growled as he strode out of the cell. The next thing Naruto knew, cool, gentle hands were easing him onto his back and then checking his body for injuries. They really made a mess of you this time, Karen whispered. Her prodding fingers reached his arm and stopped when she felt a broken bone. Brace yourself, this is going to hurt. As Sasuke's eyes slowly fluttered open, he found himself lying in a bed, staring up at a white ceiling with small cracks in the plaster and a few brown flecks that looked suspiciously like dried blood. It wasn't the first time he'd woken in a strange place with no recollection of how he'd gotten there, but that didn't make the sensation any less unsettling. As he slowly took stock of his surroundings, he became aware of something warm resting against his left hand. Without moving his head too much, he glanced down at his hand and found a head of thick pink hair that could only belong to one person. Sakura mumbled something incoherent in her sleep and began to snore softly. Sasuke smiled for a second, but then pushed the expression off his face as his mind turned to more important matters. For some reason, he was back in Konoha. More specifically, he was in Konoha's hospital. That meant, normally, that he'd been hurt. It took a few minutes of hard work, but then the memory of Yugito appeared in his mind and he had at least an idea of why he was in the hospital. Though how he was still alive was another matter altogether. Perhaps Sakura would have some answers for him when she woke up. He could have woken her, of course, but there was no real rush. For her to have fallen asleep in that position, she'd probably been up all night keeping him alive or at least watching over him. It didn't hurt anything to let her sleep a little longer. Unconsciously, his index finger began to twirl a strand of her hair while he watched her sleep. Sakura was something of a conundrum for him. He cared about her, as a friend, and was proud of what she'd become in such a short period of time, but whenever he was around her, he found himself wishing he could be somewhere else. It wasn't that he didn't want to be around her, but there was just something uncomfortable about it. For one thing, she'd kissed him. Sure, it had been 2 years ago and she'd thought she was going to die and never see him again, but that didn't change the fact that she'd kissed him. It had been his first kiss, but more importantly, it had meant something to Sakura. It was her way of officially telling him how she felt. And a little while later, he'd walked into a room, not unlike this one, and told her that her hopes and feelings were in vain. That he could never return them. That she shouldn't use the word us, because there was no us. He didn't regret it, at least, he was pretty certain he didn't regret it, but it did make things awkward, at least for him. Sakura didn't ever bring it up again. She never said anything or did anything that anyone could point to as evidence that she still carried a torch for him, but every once in a while he thought he saw something in her eyes that told him she still wanted the same thing from him that she'd always wanted. Only, since she didn't talk about it or do anything that would bring it up, he couldn't tell her to stop. Sometimes he thought that it was just some subconscious arrogance that interpreted a perfectly innocent smile or glance as more than it really meant just because he didn't think anyone could get over him. He didn't really believe that, but it did fit nicely with the arrogance he was consciously aware of. After all, he was Uchiha and the Uchiha were the best. Sakura stirred and leaned into his hand. Without thinking, he lifted his fingers and gently brushed them against her head. The moment he realized what he was doing, he pulled his hand back, shifting enough in the bed that Sakura felt it and groggily lifted her head off the bed. "You're awake," she said with a sleepy smile that became a large yawn. She looked out the window at the mid-morning light and blinked owlishly. "How long have I been laying here?" Sasuke shrugged. "I just woke up a minute ago." Sakura groaned, got out of her chair and placed her hands on the small of her back as she arched back, stretching her stiff muscles. Sasuke quickly looked away, wondering if she was really unaware of what she was doing or was just in the mood to mess with him since they hadn't seen each other in several weeks. "How did I get here?" he asked. Sakura cracked her neck twice, once in each direction, and then told him about how he was brought in by Kakashi, who had been injured as well, but had been treated and was probably already on another mission. A day and a half earlier, only a few hours after the town they'd been fighting in had all but been destroyed by Yugito and the other Cloudnen. Several others had been brought in, of course, including Shikamaru. Most of those who'd lived long enough to make it to the hospital had done so because their injuries weren't too severe. Shikamaru had been discharged the day before. The casualties weren't officially known, but Sakura said she'd heard that something close to 50 Leaf Nin had been killed during the fighting for the little town. "I do have some good news," Sakura said as she finished giving him the last of the unpleasant story. "Jiraiya-sama is going to become the new Hokage." Sasuke frowned. "Really? That's what Tsunade-sama says. He's back then?" Sakura nodded. "He got back the day before Kakashi-sensei brought you in." Tsunade-sama wouldn't say what he found out this time, but, she paused, picking her words carefully, "It seems odd that he decided to agree to become Hokage right after he got back." "You think Naruto's dead?" Sasuke interpreted for her, probably picking the exact words that she hadn't wanted to say. For a long moment, she didn't seem to have an answer to that. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "No, not really, I guess. I think Jiraiya-sama might be giving up though. Or maybe he thinks if he's Hokage, he can get more people to help him. I can't think of any other reason for him to change his mind so suddenly." Sasuke accepted her answer with a grunt and slowly sat all the way up, pushing the blankets off of himself. And then quickly pulling them back up when he saw that he was only wearing a hospital gown, and not one that fit him particularly well. "Where are my clothes?" Sakura put her hand over her mouth, trying not to laugh at him and not doing a very good job of it. He was certain she was happy for the excuse to change the subject away from their long-lost teammate. "It's not anything I haven't already seen, Sasuke-kun," she told him as she crossed the room and picked up some clothes that she had apparently retrieved from his apartment for him. "You were cut and burned from head to toe practically." She blushed a little and winked at him. "Don't worry, you have nothing to be ashamed of as near as I can tell." Sasuke found himself wishing that Yugito had managed to kill him off. "Just give me the clothes and get out." Sakura tossed them to him. "Do you want to go get something to eat after you're dressed?" she asked, probably trying to change the subject for him. Unless, of course, she was just hoping for more opportunities to tease him. "Sure." He looked out the window again. "Ichiraku is probably open by now." Sakura's face fell and she let out a long sigh. "Sasuke-kun, please, don't keep doing this to yourself." "Doing what?" he growled, already knowing the answer. It seemed like they had this conversation every time they were in the village together. "Torturing yourself," Sakura cried, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "Naruto's gone. I wish he wasn't. I wish we could change it, but it's been 2 years. You have to move on." "Is that what you've done?" he snapped. "Did you just forget about him and move on with your life?" Sakura covered her face with her hands, pushing her fingers against her eyes and then slid them together so she could pinch the bridge of her nose. He knew she hated talking about their former teammate with him, or with anyone else for that matter. It wasn't hard to see that she missed Naruto terribly. She was in the village more than he was, so it was probably worse for her. He could try to distract himself with the missions and war, but she had been spending more and more time off the front lines as her abilities became more and more useful to the village hospital. She was constantly surrounded by things that reminded her of him. Sasuke had once heard her gasp as a crowd of people had passed them and one of the members had been a young woman with blonde hair that was spiky at the top. Neither of them had commented on it at the time, But now he wondered how often she thought she saw him as she walked past some of the places they'd hung out during their time as Team 7. A part of him felt ashamed for accusing her of forgetting him. "Of course I haven't forgotten him," she answered in as calm a voice as she could muster, but he saw her throat constrict as she finished. "I won't ever forget him, but eventually you have to be realistic. I've read everything I could find on Orochimaru. Hell, I spent practically a whole night talking Tsunade-sama into telling me all she knew about him. I've even managed to find the reports of his experiments." Her voice trailed off and she took a slow deep breath to calm herself. "Sasuke-kun," she whispered after a few seconds, a tear trickling down her cheek, "the pictures in some of those reports, it wouldn't take Orochimaru 2 years to reduce Naruto to something we wouldn't even recognize as human. And that would be if the experiment was actually a success. I'm sorry. Naruto's gone and I don't think he's coming back." Sasuke's jaw flexed and his eyes burned in a way that once would have sent her scurrying away, or at least would have had her apologizing for even thinking something that he disagreed with, but those days were long gone now. She wasn't that little girl with the crush. She was a fully trained ninja. She'd fought on the front lines of a war. She'd sat in a field, covered in blood, trying to keep a fellow Leaf shinobi from bleeding to death. She'd saved people and killed people. She'd made hard choices and learned to accept the consequences. He just couldn't scare her anymore. Probably, that was a good thing. Sakura took a step towards him and gently touched his arm. "Sasuke-kun," she whispered with a sniffle, "I just don't want to see you keep hurting yourself like this, but, if it's so important to you, we can go to Ichiraku. Just, let's not talk about finding Naruto or anything like that." She gave him a sad smile. "Let's try to remember the good times we had with him." Sasuke's muscles remained tense under her fingertips, but then slowly relaxed as he took a deep breath and nodded. "Fine," he grunted. It was a painful concession, but she was probably right. Not about Naruto never coming back, of course. Sasuke would only believe that when he saw Naruto's body with his own eyes. A sight that if he ever saw it would be quickly followed by the sight of Orochimaru's head being removed from his neck. But when he was with Sakura, it would probably be better to remember the good times. She didn't understand how to be an Avenger like he did. Dark thoughts didn't give her strength. With her, he could let a little bit of light in, just enough to keep him from completely slipping into the darkness. It was probably something Naruto would approve of anyway. Kurenai had sent word that Hinata and her teammates were supposed to meet her at the training grounds, so Hinata had used it as an excuse to get out of the house. Technically, she was 2 hours early to the meeting, but it was important to be punctual, particularly when some of the clan elders had been expressing interest in hearing about her mission. No doubt, they would, depending on whether or not her father was present, either congratulate her on dispatching 4 enemies on her own or scold her for letting such a large group ambush her team. Hinata didn't think taking a life, even an enemy's life, was something to be congratulated for. If that was what they wanted to do, they would be better off talking to Shino and Kiba since they'd taken care of most of the ambushers. She felt bad enough about not seeing the trap as it was. She didn't need anyone to add to her shame in that department. Just as she reached the training posts, she heard the rhythmic thumping of the ground as someone ran towards her and opened her eyes to find Hanabi moving quickly across the grass. It was rare to see Hanabi outside of their family compound, rarer still to find her not in the presence of one of the elders. Hinata was certain that Hanabi was supposed to be spending her day with their father as he dealt with some business. That was another reason she'd been so quick to latch onto an excuse to get out of the house that morning. "Father is asking for you," Hanabi called without any greeting. Hinata rose smoothly to her feet. "Why?" she asked, a strange sense of dread building in her. "I don't know, but..." Hanabi didn't need to take it any farther. For their father to ask for her, for him to send Hanabi to get her, it had to be important. Hinata accepted the non-explanation with a nod and the two raced back towards their house. When she got there, Hinata found her father sitting alone in the room used for meeting with dignitaries, his legs crossed as his eyes closed. "Come in and shut the door," he told them without opening his eyes. Hanabi closed the door and then she and Hinata took their places in front of him, bowing their heads and waiting for him to tell them what he had to say. Hiyashi did not make them wait long. "I have made a decision that will greatly affect the future of the village. For better or ill, I cannot say." The two young women exchanged glances and then Hanabi asked, "What decision have you made?" Hiyashi's eyes drifted from her to Hinata. A tsunami was upon us, he said softly. We could either be crushed or join the wave. In the end, the Hyuga must survive. Hinata sucked in a sharp breath. Please, father, what has happened? Hiyashi let out a slow breath and then his eyes shifted to the window through which he could see the tree that was planted in the courtyard. There will be a new Hokage, he whispered. The Hyuga could no longer refrain from joining the wave that will sweep through the village this afternoon. The council did not see Jiraiya as soon as he'd sent word that he would accept the position of Hokage. They didn't see him the next day either. Now, on the third day, they were finally getting around to it. It was an insult. It was the sort of insult that they never would have dared to give him when the third was still in charge. It was the sort of insult that said they were feeling more powerful than any village council ever had before them during the relatively brief history of Konoha. It was the sort of insult that he'd expected from them. They'd had over a year of basically running the village by themselves. His appointment as Hokage would take some of that power away from them. No doubt a few had hoped that the third would die before Jiraiya or Tsunade acquiesced to the duty he'd set before them. Most every member, certainly all of the senior members, of the council were aware of the third's state. They knew the end wasn't far off. A few more days or weeks and Jiraiya and Tsunade would have to have been nominated by the council to take the title of Hokage. Were it not for some of the more troubling members of the council, Jiraiya would have been happy to leave the process up to them. Unfortunately, he couldn't do that. He had a duty to Naruto, to Minato, and to the third. Much as he wanted to, he couldn't turn his back on that. It just would have been so much easier if Tsunade had taken up the burden for him. Still, it wasn't all bad, he thought as his hand patted the small slip of paper in his pocket. Being Hokage would open some very important and useful options that might otherwise have been closed to him. Jiraiya sighed and rubbed his weary eyes as he stood before the doors to the room the council had designated for the meeting. It could be argued that he'd gone to great lengths to avoid doing what he was about to do. He'd trained someone to be the perfect person to take the job, he'd left the village for several years, he'd outright turned the job down, he'd tried to talk someone he considered to be more qualified into taking it. There really wasn't anything more he could do to keep the hat off his head. Stupid fate, he grumbled to himself as he pushed the doors open and entered the crowded room. Jiraiya, Mitokado Homura said in an almost surprised-sounding voice as he looked up, "Thank you for your patience." Jiraiya did his best to smile good-naturedly at the third's old teammate. "Of course, things have been busy lately." Homura nodded and ran his hand along his gray beard as he motioned for Jiraiya to take his place at a small table set apart from where the council was seated. Jiraiya rolled his eyes as he noted the lack of a chair for him to sit in. Were they really planning on being this childish about the whole thing? Without acting as though anything were out of the ordinary, Jiraiya bit his thumb and pressed his hand onto the ground. Dark seals spread out from his palm and in a puff of smoke, a large, orange toad appeared beneath him. The toad looked up curiously as Jiraiya crossed his legs and got comfortable. "Sorry," the toad Sennin whispered. "Next time I'll call you, it'll be when I'm at a bathhouse." "Yeah, because that's always so much fun," the toad replied with a roll of his large eyes. "Plus," Jiraiya continued as if the toad hadn't said anything, "you can let everyone on Myobokuzen know how this goes." "Oh, goody? You all know why we are here." Danzo spoke up before Jiraiya could offer a retort to the toad. Jiraiya has been nominated by the third to take the title of Hokage and has finally decided to accept the nomination. The council members all nodded, none of them looked Jiraiya in the eyes. "You also know my feelings on this matter?" Danzo went on. "I don't," Jiraiya pointed out calmly. Danzo seemed almost caught off guard by the interruption. His head was wrapped in bandages, his right eye completely hidden by them, so he had to turn slightly to glare at Jiraiya. "You aren't really a member of Konoha anymore," he told Jiraiya coldly. "You left the village for a great many years while you traveled, ignoring requests for you to return. When you did come back, you spent all of your time with Uzumaki Naruto and then quickly left again. And then, after the boy's apparent abduction, you told this council that you would not be counted as one of Konoha's resources and that you would not join the war effort, despite our need." Jiraiya let his eyes drift from Danzo to the other members of the council. None of them looked too uncomfortable with what was being said. Even Homura and the third's other teammate, Utatane Kaharu, were not shuffling awkwardly in their seats or appearing to consider arguing the conclusion Danzo was obviously working towards. Jiraiya knew that neither of the third's teammates were overly fond of him. Homura was too stuffy and serious, and Kaharu still held a bit of a grudge for the time she thought she'd caught a much younger Jiraiya peeking on her while she was changing. He'd tried to explain that she was the last person he'd ever want to peek at, but that hadn't really raised his stocks any with her. The one who takes the title of Hokage must lead this village. The one who takes the title of Hokage must be a part of this village. The one who takes the title of Hokage should not be a man who is barely still a member of the village, who probably couldn't find his way to the Anbu headquarters from here without stopping to get directions. Jiraiya wanted to argue that Danzo was completely off base, but before he could, it occurred to him that he probably couldn't find the Anbu headquarters if they'd moved it in the past 10 years or so. He'd had no reason to visit it since returning to the village. Danzo leveled his gaze at Jiraiya and, in an even voice, said, "I call for a vote on Jiraiya's nomination." Kaharu nodded, the gray bun of hair on the back of her head bouncing. All in favor? No one raised their hand. Jiraiya let his eyes drift from one council member to the next. He'd underestimated just how big of a mistake he'd made by alienating Konoha's power base and focusing so completely on finding Naruto. Never in a million years would he have guessed that the council would take such an unprecedented step by denying a living Hokage's wishes concerning his successor. Granted, there had never been circumstances like this surrounding the selecting of a new Hokage, but it was still surprising to see. "For you to take such a step," Jiraiya said softly, "you must have received the backing from a great many of the clans." Danzo smiled victoriously. "Almost all of them. Will we continue without a Hokage? We will have a new Hokage by the end of the day. You aren't really a part of this village, so it doesn't concern you." Jiraiya looked at Homura and Kaharu. "The old man would be disappointed in you," he told them coldly. Homura adjusted his glasses, a nervous gesture that Jiraiya hadn't seen out of him in years, maybe decades. "I think the third would understand that what we do for the good of the village." "I'm sorry, Jiraiya, but we don't feel that you are the right person for this job." Jiraiya shrugged. "No argument there, but don't try to act all high and noble about it. I know how this group works. The only way you'd go against tradition like this is if you were all scared or—" His eyes turned towards Danzo. Someone saw an opportunity. He stood and hopped off of the toad as it disappeared in a cloud of smoke. "For the good of the village," he snorted, "I never realized you had a sense of humor." Without waiting to be dismissed, he turned and headed for the door. They'd made their decision, nothing he could say would change it. "Jiraiya," Danzo called out just before he reached the door, "when the new Hokage takes office, he'll be calling up all those who have been on reserve. Regardless of how they feel on the matter, if they don't report in as resources, they'll be considered missing nin." Jiraiya absorbed that for a moment and then pushed the doors open and walked out. A sharp twist of his hand set the bone and sent agonizing pain up his arm and down the length of his body. Naruto let out a small grunt, but held the worst of it in. With the bone set, Karen began to work away over the rest of his body. "Sorry about that," she said softly. "I can heal you, but the bones won't heal right if I don't set them first." He nodded without comment. She told him the same thing every time Orochimaru or someone else did something that broke his body. Karen quickly finished her examination and then slid her hand under his neck and slowly helped him sit up. Her hands cupped his cheeks, keeping his head more or less upright as she stared questioningly into his eyes. "What are you going to do?" Naruto swallowed and then looked past her to where Jugo was sitting, quietly for a change, against the far wall, chains holding him in place should he try to move. Karen turned his head so he was looking at her once more. "Are you really going to make Orochimaru-sama start killing your friends just to keep your secret?" Naruto scowled and pulled his face away from her hands. Karen sighed, adjusting her glasses, and said, "Look, as a friend, let me give you some advice. Just let Orochimaru-sama have what he wants. If I do that, people will die." Karen patted him gently on the shoulder, careful to avoid putting too much pressure on any of his injuries. "I'm sorry, Naruto-kun, but people are going to die no matter what. If you give Orochimaru-sama what he wants, maybe fewer of them will. Definitely fewer will die right in front of you. That's probably the best thing you could hope for at his point." Naruto had no answer for her. He knew she was wrong, or at least he was pretty certain that 2 years earlier he would have been sure that she was wrong. But the facts were that he couldn't protect anyone from where he was, and he wasn't sure he would be able to hold out if one of his friends, his real friends, were dragged in front of him and executed because he refused to admit that there was no time travel jutsu. Karen let him think about it for a few seconds and then began to pull up her right shirt sleeve. Come on, let's get this over with. A part of him wanted to refuse the healing, but, as always, the moment her soft skin touched his dried, cracked lips, he opened his mouth and dutifully bit down, drawing the healing chakra into his body. The first few times Karen had healed him, he'd tried to resist. Every time, however, his resolve broke just as it had here. During his more lucid days, he'd often wondered if there wasn't some sort of pheromone released by her skin that caused him to bid down on her. Certainly as time went on, he'd found himself becoming more and more willing to receive the healing. Sometimes he even craved it just a little, almost as if there was an addictive property to it. From what he remembered of her past when he'd read about it in the future, her mother had had the same ability. If that was true, then it might have explained Karen's comment that men came and used her mother up. They'd been addicted to more than just what she offered them as part of her job as a prostitute. With his wounds healed, Karen sat down next to him, breathing heavily from the exertion of him sucking chakra out of her body. As her breathing returned to normal, Karen leaned over and kissed him softly on the forehead. "You're a good man," she whispered without pulling away, her lips lightly brushing against his skin in a way that was strangely pleasant and totally out of place with his surroundings. "Good men deserve better than what you've been put through the last 2 years." She pulled back and brushed his dirty hair out of his eyes, smiling at the small lipstick mark she'd left on his forehead. "Please, just give Orochimaru what he wants. I don't know if I can keep coming and seeing you being treated like this." Naruto looked up at her, his guts feeling like Jugo had flipped them upside down during his beating. "Why you could always, help me escape," he whispered hoarsely. She smiled sadly and ran her fingertips along his cheek. "I wish I could," she told him, and he wanted to believe her, but when I come in here, there are always 6 guards waiting just outside, plus a few more watching through the video camera. I'd just get both of us killed if I tried it." Naruto sighed and looked away, nodding slowly in understanding. Karen watched him carefully for a moment and then asked, "What is it that you have that makes Orochimaru-sama so crazy?" Naruto closed his mouth, refusing to reply. Karen waited for almost a minute before pushing a little harder. "It must be really important. I've never seen him like this before, or with anything else." Naruto remained silent. "Right," Karen said, slowly standing and turning towards the door. "I guess I forgot that I'm just Orochimaru's whore, didn't I? The two of you use me to keep you alive, but after that, you just toss me aside." She scowled down at him so fiercely that Naruto felt his insides freeze. He didn't want to make her mad. She took 2 steps towards the door, while he debated what he wanted to do. "Sorry, Naruto-kun," she whispered when she reached the door. "You'll have to find another whore. I won't be coming back again. Please, don't make too many people suffer for whatever it is that you know." "Tea time travel," Naruto whispered, hating himself for it, but unable to stop. She was his only real companion, besides Jugo. When he wasn't lost in his insanity, if she left, he didn't think he could take it. Karen paused and turned around, staring down at him. She glanced at the door, which was closed, and then at Jugo, who was watching the whole scene in silence. There was an almost serene expression on the large man's face, the same look he always got when he came down off of the high he received whenever he gave into his blood lust. "Time travel?" Karen repeated in a hushed voice. "What do you mean?" "I have a time travel jutsu," Naruto told her. He meant to say, "Orochimaru thinks I have a time travel jutsu," but somewhere between his brain and his lips, the words had been altered. He was so weary of the whole mess, he wasn't sure why he'd gone back to lying to his friend, but it was too late to take back his words. If he recanted them now, there was the chance that she really would leave, and the more he thought about it, the less he wanted to actually tell the truth anyway. Karen swallowed hard. "A time travel jutsu?" She gave him an incredulous look. "You have a jutsu that lets you travel back in time?" Naruto nodded. Now that she wasn't threatening to never return, it was easier to think clearly. He hadn't realized just how dangerously attached to her he actually was. She was better at her job than he'd realized, assuming it really was her job to get him to fess up. It was hard to think she'd do something like that to him. They were friends after all, but the small part of his brain that did think so was pretty certain of it. In the future, he whispered, I was sort of the Hokage of Konoha. We were fighting a war, it wasn't going well, so I invented a jutsu that would fix things. He smiled and looked pointedly around the room. It didn't quite go the way I thought it would. Karen frowned as her eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you just messing around with me? Naruto shook his head. He tried to lick his dry lips, but his tongue was sticky and it pulled at the dried skin, cracking it farther so that a thin trail of blood ran down his lips and onto his chin. Orochimaru's FR from the future too. I brought him back by mistake. She stared at him for a moment and then said, tell me how to do it. Naruto shook his head. Sorry, he told her and genuinely meant it. She stepped closer to him and dropped to her knees so she could look him in the eyes. Please, she whispered, her voice choked and her eyes glassy. Please, with a jutsu like that, I could save my mother. I could go back and keep her out of that place or warn her about the people I felt coming, the ones who. Naruto looked down. He couldn't tell her that he didn't know how to do it, but he felt terrible seeing the distress on her face. You wouldn't have enough chakra for it. I'm a Jinchuriki and it just about took everything I had. Karen was quiet for a moment and then said, we could go together. What? You took Orochimaru on accident, but you could take me on purpose. That way I could warn my mom and you could keep Orochimaru from catching you. She stood and paced almost to the door, turned around, and walked back kneeling next to him again. Are there seals that you have to use or something? Naruto nodded on reflex more than because he wanted to lie to her. You've gone through a lot, do you remember them? Yes. Her red eyes lit up. Show me. I don't have enough chakra, he told her. Orochimaru, he sealed off Kyuubi, I can't use the jutsu. Karen smiled and put her hands on his shoulders. I know, she whispered, but this is dangerous for me. I think I can talk Hiroshi into not closing your tenketsu next time he gets sent in here, but I won't do it if you're just messing around with me. Naruto slowly brought his hands together. Go slowly, Karen said before he could start, I want to see them. That sealed it in his mind. Hard as it was, Naruto pushed the thoughts of her being his friend away. She was just another way for Orochimaru to torture him. He'd known what she was from the beginning, but after months and months of her being the only good thing in his life, he'd tried to pretend that her friendship was real. And yet, some weak part of him, a very large weak part of him, still loved her. But not enough to throw everything away for her lies. Naruto looked up at her, his eyes narrowing, and said, get out. Karen frowned, confused. What? You heard me, whore, he snarled with as much energy as he could muster. I'll leave before my tenketsu open and I rip you to shreds. Naruto, you're just another one of his tricks, Naruto cut her off. It had been a long while since he really felt rage. Even longer since he'd felt any strength from that rage, but it was starting to build now. He wouldn't be breaking out of his cell with it, certainly not going toe-to-toe with Orochimaru, but he almost felt like some of the molasses that his body had been stuck in for the past 2 years was starting to give way. I show you the jutsu, they get it on video or you remember how it goes, and then hand it right over to Orochimaru. I'm not the idiot you obviously think I am. Karen shook her head, slowly standing. I'm not a trick, Naruto-kun. I really am your friend, but if you don't trust me, I can understand that. Naruto tried to stand as well. He couldn't take on Orochimaru in his current state, but perhaps he had enough strength to handle her. Karen's hand shot forward, catching him in the chest and knocking the wind from his lungs and from his sails. Without being able to use chakra, he really was as helpless as he'd seemed for the past 2 years. The metal door behind them was flung open, slamming against the wall so loudly that the ringing echoed off the walls for what seemed to be several seconds as 3 large sound nin marched into the room, each tensed for trouble and looking at Naruto. Karen leaned down and whispered, sorry, Naruto-kun, but if you'd attacked me I would have had to heal you all over again once they were through with you. I was just trying to protect you. Naruto heard her, but he didn't respond. He just lay there on the dirty floor, trying to breathe and mostly failing. A few seconds later, he was chained to the wall and everyone but Jugo was gone. Jugo, who was his last companion. Jugo, who would start muttering to himself in a few minutes. Jugo, who would start asking if he could kill him in an hour. Jugo, who would try to kill him by the end of the day. Naruto had often felt despair since waking up to find himself Orochimaru's prisoner, but never like this. There had always been thoughts of keeping Orochimaru so distracted with the promise of a time travel jutsu that he left Sasuke and all of his other friends alone. Then there had been the anticipation of the next time Karen, his only escape from the loneliness and pain of his life, would visit him. And now there was nothing. He couldn't pretend that Karen wasn't what she was anymore. He couldn't pretend that his refusal to talk would keep everyone safe because it would now have the opposite effect if Orochimaru carried through with his threat. He wished that they'd just let Jugo finish him off. Jiraiya walked as quickly as he could without running back to the third's room. He didn't have a lot of time, in fact, he had almost no time at all. The only thing keeping him from running was the thought that if someone saw him, they might guess what he was planning. Danzo would be Hokage, nothing could stop that now. Once Danzo was Hokage, Jiraiya and Tsunade would either have to become active members of Konoha's ninja corps once more or flee as missing nin. That wasn't really as big of a deal as it sounded like. He doubted Konoha had the manpower to spare a hunter to go after them, but it would force them to leave the village and lose a lot of resources that he needed at the moment. So, before that happened, he had to take advantage of the thin window where he could still maneuver. It wouldn't be much, but it was better than nothing. Jiraiya pulled the piece of paper from his pocket, not so much to read it, he already knew what it said, but simply so he could feel it in his hand and be assured that it was real. Temari and her brothers had found Orochimaru's hideout. Not only had they found it, but they'd confirmed that he was there. It didn't necessarily mean that Naruto was there, but Jiraiya was confident that Orochimaru wouldn't let Naruto out of his sight, assuming Naruto was still alive, of course. It was his job now to get reinforcements so they could make their move. The Cage's children wanted information on why their father had so suddenly turned on them, and Jiraiya wanted Naruto. He wasn't sure why, but he thought that saving Naruto would give them their answers as well. Certainly that was what he'd told them when they'd agreed to help each other. If he'd become Hokage, the first thing he'd intended to do was assign a group of elite Junin to help infiltrate Orochimaru's base and bring Naruto out, or at least discover what had happened to him. Since he wasn't going to be the Hokage and the man who he strongly suspected would be Hokage wouldn't be willing to assign such a mission, Jiraiya only had one option. He had to get the third to assign the mission before he was no longer in office. Chances were, he wouldn't be able to get his elite team of Junin, but if he was assigned to the team instead of sitting in an office, then he didn't think they'd need as many of them anyway. Given the nature of the orders and the fact that it would be coming barely before the third was out of office, with few objective witnesses to it being assigned, no less, he couldn't afford to bring people who didn't care about the mission or who might turn back if counter orders were issued by the new Hokage. He needed Naruto's friends. Jiraiya entered the building and then allowed himself to pick up more speed, hurrying towards the darkened room that already smelled of death and decay. Even as he entered the room, he was pulling out a scroll and a brush for the third to use. Tsunade looked up at him in surprise. He didn't bother explaining what she could guess. If he'd been named Hokage, it would have taken longer and he'd have other things to deal with that would keep him from returning so early. "Is he awake?" Jiraiya asked without preamble. Tsunade shook her head. "I put him under a few minutes ago, the pain was getting to be too much." "Can you wake him?" "Why would I do that?" Jiraiya handed her the message he'd received from Temari. "I'm going to need him to assign a mission." Tsunade scanned the note quickly and then handed it back as she leaned over the third's frail body and began forming seals. "Who did they choose?" she asked as her hands began to move over the old man's chest. "No one officially, but it will be Danzo. He was running the meeting already, hardly anyone else even spoke." In the dim light, he saw her throat constrict and then she leaned back and sighed. "It will take a moment for him to regain consciousness, but this is going to hurt him a lot. It had better be worth it." Jiraiya nodded and began writing on the paper. "While we wait, go find someone, maybe two someones, not connected to us to watch him sign this." "Why?" "Danzo's going to call up the reserves, even the ones who are technically retired. You and I are on that list. If I can get us on a mission, we'll have a little bit of time to get Naruto and figure out our next move, but the mission will be challenged if it's just you and me that witness it being signed. Hell, it'll be challenged anyway, but this might keep the others from getting into too much trouble." To her credit, Tsunade didn't question his plan further. She knew what being called back to active duty, or refusing to accept a call back to active duty, would mean. She simply nodded and slipped out of the room to find what they needed. Jiraiya worded the mission very carefully, not wanting to have it recalled for something as stupid as unclear objectives or some other technicality. When he reached the point where he would need to pick the names of those being assigned, he had to pause and consider who he needed and, more importantly, who he could get in such a short period of time. Kakashi, unfortunately, was out of the village again. Had Jiraiya become Hokage, Kakashi would have been the one chosen to lead the mission. Sasuke, however, had been in the hospital and probably wouldn't be back on active duty for at least another day or two. Sakura, of course, was working in the hospital, so she was available, though there was always the chance that she had orders that would have her leaving shortly. Jiraiya paused and reworded a part of the mission so that it took precedence over previously issued orders. They would be moving through unknown areas, so they would need a team that was skilled at tracking and threat detection. Several such teams existed, but among ninja Naruto's age, there were only a few. Hyuga Hinata, Jiraiya was pretty certain, was friends with Naruto. He'd never spoken with her, but she'd been among the group that had been waiting for them when he, Tsunade, and Kakashi's team had returned from the failed attempt to retrieve Naruto. Jiraiya couldn't remember what team she was on, so he simply called it Hyuga Hinata's team, and hoped that it would work well enough. Based on reputation alone, Jiraiya put down Nara Shikamaru's name next. The young man was Naruto's age and supposedly a tactical genius. Besides that, he was a Nara, and that meant his jutsu probably specialized in delaying and immobilizing enemies, which might be important should they run into trouble. He didn't know if Shikamaru was in the village, however, but if he wasn't they would just have to get by with all the other supposed geniuses in the group. Just before he finished with the mission, a thought struck him and he included the option to pick up any other ninja deemed necessary to the completion of the mission so long as they agreed to come. He couldn't force an unnamed member to join the team, but at least he gave himself the option of trying to convince them. Jiraiya was just finishing writing up a second copy and looking it over when a pain-filled gasp signaled the third's awakening. He was next to his old mentor's bed in the blink of an eye. "Sorry, old man," Jiraiya whispered, not sure how much of what he was saying could be understood, "but I need you for something important." The third squeezed his eyes shut against another wave of pain and then looked up at his pupil and nodded just enough for it to be clear that it was intentional. Hokage? Jiraiya shook his head. "I'm sorry, the council turned me down." The third let out a slow breath. Danzo, he grunted. Of course. Jiraiya nodded. "Why you found Naruto?" "I did. I need you to assign Tsunade and I, plus a few other people, to get him back. I've already got the request written up." The third's whole body shuddered and Jiraiya could see his teeth pressed together as another bout of pain coursed through him. "Why yes, of course," he whispered when it passed. Jiraiya glanced at the door, wishing Tsunade would hurry. "We need witnesses first. This won't be something the council smiles upon as it is." He looked back down at the third, letting his eyes slowly drift along the old man's thin body and then carefully examining his face. He looked ancient now. Even when he was an old man of 70 when Jiraiya had initially returned to the village, he hadn't looked this old. 2 years didn't seem like enough time to go from old enough to be teased about it to old enough to look like a corpse. It wasn't fair. "I'm sorry that I didn't stick around," Jiraiya whispered. "I should have stayed after Minato. I should have taken the name Hokage long before this." The third's lips turned up slightly in what might have been a smile. I am proud of who you became. YUW would have been a good Hokage, but UW weren't ready then." Jiraiya nodded. The third would never say that he was forgiven for leaving, because doing so would imply that Jiraiya needed to be forgiven, but this was close enough. The door opened and Tsunade entered with 3 confused people trailing behind her. One was an older man who didn't look like he'd ever been a ninja. The second was a middle-aged woman in a Chunin vest. And the third was a young boy, probably not old enough to enter the academy yet. Jiraiya looked at each of them and smiled. They would do nicely. It would be difficult for Danzo to accuse the boy of lying because he was young enough to still look innocent all the time. The woman was a ninja whose integrity would be tough to question while keeping her on active duty. And the man was old enough to be past the age where he could be intimidated by the presence of 2 of the Sannin, if he even knew who they were. "You 3 are here to witness the third assigning a mission. Because we are close to getting a new Hokage, there might be some questions as to the validity of the mission. As witnesses, All you have to do is tell the council or our new Hokage what you saw. Nothing underhanded is happening, so tell the truth." He handed them both copies of the paper, letting them each read it. The boy might not have actually been able to read, but he at least looked at the paper as though he could, and allowing them to check that the two were identical. Once they had handed them back to him, he read the mission out loud so it couldn't be said that the third didn't know what he was signing, and then handed the papers and the brush to the Hokage. Sarutobi's hand shook considerably as he signed his name to each, but no one could deny that it was his signature. Even if they did, 5 people had seen him sign it. Jiraiya then had the 3, as well as himself and Tsunade, sign one of the papers as witnesses. After that, he thanked the old man, woman, and boy and sent them on their way as he handed one of the signed papers to Tsunade while pocketing the other. "Deliver this to the Hokage's desk." He didn't need to add that he didn't want it actually given to anyone lest the fight over it start before he got his team out of the village. Tsunade nodded, but before she left, she returned to the third side and injected something into his arm. "This will let you sleep for a while," she told him. "I'll make sure someone is here when you wake up." Without another word, she hurried out of the room and headed toward the Hokage Tower. Jiraiya looked down at his mentor, who was already starting to feel the effects of the drugs. "Thanks, old man. Try to be alive when I get back, huh?" The third smiled weakly and was asleep a second later. Jiraiya didn't waste any time as he rushed to find the members of his new team. He had to get them gathered and out of the village before Danzo found out about the mission. Hyuga Hinata was the easiest to find. She was at her home, speaking to her father. The branch family member who went and retrieved her fro Jiraiya had been reluctant to interrupt the meeting, even for a member of the Sannin, but he hadn't required too much convincing. Once he had Hinata, and had managed to get her to stop bowing and going through the whole polite greeting routine, it was easy to find the rest. Jiraiya had always enjoyed having a set of Hyuga eyes on his missions. They streamlined matters considerably. Sakura and Sasuke were found at the Ichiraku ramen bar. Shikamaru was in the village, lying down on the roof of his house staring up at the sky. His mother had greatly helped in getting him moving. Jiraiya liked her immediately, though he suspected his opinion would change if she ever got annoyed with him. The rest of Hinata's team, Team 8, she told him, were with Yuhi Kurenai at one of the training grounds. Kurenai had been confused by the fact that her team, who were supposed to be going on another scouting mission in a few days, was suddenly being reassigned, but after reading Jiraiya's copy of the mission, she didn't ask any more questions. She did offer her services, but Jiraiya had to turn her down. Taking Chunin was bad enough, taking a Junin on the mission might draw more attention to it than he could afford. If the mission was discovered before they made it out of the village, it would never happen. It was at this point that Shikamaru got his hands on the mission sheet. Up until this point, Jiraiya hadn't told any of them what they were being assigned to do. Once he'd read it, he had a few suggestions about additional team members. Hyuga Neji, he thought, would be invaluable, and he also suggested Akamichi Choji. Hinata informed them that Neji's team was on a mission and wouldn't be back for at least a week, but Choji was eating a post-lunch snack with his father not far from the village gates. With the last of the team assembled and Tsunade and Shizune, Tonton had been placed in the care of one of Shizune's friends. Waiting for them at the gates, Jiraiya showed the guards the mission assignment and quickly got everyone out the gates. It was not the team that he'd thought he'd be sending to help the Case Cage's children, but it was a good team, certainly the best team he could have assembled given what they were signing up for and his time constraints. 2 days later, Temari was growing impatient. They'd sent word to Jiraiya almost 5 days earlier. If he was going to send a team to help them, or at least show up himself, he should have done so already. She and her brothers were camped a few kilometers from Orochimaru's lair, sitting together in a large cave that Gaara had dug out of the side of a small mountain. The entrance to the cave had been sealed off by a small landslide that Gaara pushed back whenever they left to spy on Orochimaru or search for the promised Konoha reinforcements. At the entrance, they'd arranged a few rocks and some bushes in a way that would probably look odd, but not very remarkable, to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. The team from Konoha, if they showed up, would hopefully spot the sign that they designated as the rendezvous site in their message to Jiraiya. "They aren't coming," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Something's happened and they aren't going to help us." Kankuro shrugged, running his fingers through his unruly red hair. "Leaf Nin are slow, what did you expect? They've probably been on their way since they got our message, but just aren't fast enough to get here yet. Tamari glanced at Gaara, curious about his thoughts. Her younger brother didn't add anything. He simply poked the fire they were sitting around and then looked up at the hole he'd created in the ceiling that carried most of the smoke out of their temporary dwelling and up to a spot on the far side of the mountain from Orochimaru's base. His face looked strange in the flickering light, even stranger with the black hair that he'd been sporting for the past 2 years. Even though she'd been the one to dye it for him and had had plenty of time to get used to it, Tamari still found herself thinking of him with his natural red coloring. From the looks of things, his roots were starting to grow out again. She'd had to see if she could talk him into letting her dye it the next time they had the chance. Besides, Kankuro continued, what can we do if they don't show? Orochimaru's not some weak ninja from Iwa. We can't just storm the place without backup. Tamari knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier to sit around waiting for reinforcements that might not ever arrive. It was dangerous for them to be in any place for too long, but extremely dangerous for them to be in this place. Every day they stayed, they ran the risk of being discovered, if not by Orochimaru and his men, then by some patrolling Iwagakure team. Even though they were missing Nin, Iwa wouldn't take kindly to their presence in the Earth Country and they couldn't exactly flee back to the Wind Country to find shelter. Suddenly, Gaara stiffened as the earth above them trembled just a little, sending a small cloud of dust into the fire. Without a word, Gaara rose and walked to the covered entrance to their cave. He held his hands in front of him, as if warming them on the rocks and dirt, and then lifted them up. A small opening appeared in front of him, not large enough to get anything through, but large enough to see out of. Keeping one hand up, he brought the other up to his left eye. Sand swirled in front of him, forming into a sphere that then took the appearance of an eye. The sand eye rose up and slipped through the hole in the wall and then almost instantly returning to normal sand and making its way back to his gourd. They're here, Gaara said. He held both hands up, the muscles in his arms straining for a second, and then dirt covering the entrance exploded outwards, carried away by the sand he'd created within it. The 3 former sand nin stepped out into the evening light and found themselves face to face with Jiraiya and small group of younger ninja as well as a woman Tamari instantly recognized as Tsunade of the Sannin. Jiraiya hadn't let them down after all. Just behind Tsunade, Tamari spotted Nara Shikamaru, the genin who had basically defeated her in the Chunin exam. She let out an annoyed groan. Kankuro bumped her with his elbow, he'd seen him too. Shut up, she growled under her breath. It was, in her opinion, Kankuro's fault that she had lost. If he hadn't left the remains of his puppet lying around, she might not have suffered that annoying defeat, and it was a defeat. Still, Shikamaru had displayed an impressive amount of intelligence during their fight, so his presence on this mission wasn't all bad, just a little annoying. Fortunately, even if she was a bad loser, she wasn't the sort of girl would get caught up in holding a grudge for something so insignificant, well, not much of one, anyway. Jiraiya looked up at the darkening sky and nodded. We don't have a lot of time to plan before it gets dark, so let's not waste any of it. He sat down and motioned for the others to do the same. Let's start with what you know about Orochimaru's base and go from there. Tamari quickly launched into her explanation. They really didn't know much, being unwilling to try to take any prisoners to find out more because they couldn't risk being found out, but they had rough guesses on how many guards were around the entrance as well as locations of possible other entrances. Everyone was well aware of the fact that they would be completely blind except for what heads-up Hinata could offer them as they did what they had to. The plan that they came up with was relatively straightforward, it had to be. The only piece of trickery would come with getting in. Tamari had carefully explored the area around the base and was relatively certain that, if they were cautious, they could make it to the back of the base, near the river, and enter from behind. There were no doorways or entrances back there that she'd been able to see, but the ground was already sandy. It wouldn't take much for Gaara to turn it completely to sand and then he could simply move it aside and let them break into the base itself. After that, it would be up to Hinata to find Naruto within the base and guide a small group of them there while the rest held their exit and dealt with any surprises. Jiraiya was careful to make it clear that if the surprise took the shape of Orochimaru, they were to get out of his way and let him deal with his former teammate. Despite its simplicity, it was an extremely dangerous way to go about a mission. Too much was left up in the air and there were too many ways in which it could go disastrously wrong, but they didn't have much choice in the matter at this point. So, it looks like it's right over there, Deidara remarked as he and Sasori stood on a hill not far from Orochimaru's base. He tipped his conical hat back and brushed aside the strips of cloth hanging from it that were used to hide the identities of Akatsuki members while they were on missions. Of course, he often pointed out to Sasori, walking next to a large, hunchbacked man who dragged so low to the ground that he actually left a small trail through the soft dirt, made it sort of difficult to hide who they were. The black cloaks with the red cloud designs probably didn't help much either. The hats did serve to keep the sun off his face, he supposed, so there were some benefits to it at least. I told you that's where it was, Sasori growled, not even looking up or trying to escape from his hunched-over position. Did you actually doubt me? Deidara chose to ignore the question as he brushed his long blonde hair back from his face. I wonder what he's like, We haven't seen him since Itachi. It doesn't matter. He's got the Kyuubi and is causing us some trouble with this war. We don't have any choice but to deal with him now. Deidara lifted a small bag from under his robe and bounced it carefully in his hand as if checking its weight. Will that really be enough? Sasori asked. If not, master, you can always use some of those disgusting puppets of yours, Wouldn't that be ironic, for you to be saved by something so against your tastes? Maybe I'll make a couple of them explode, Then they'd be real works of art. Whatever, Sasori growled again. Get going before we're spotted. This has been drawn out too long as it is. Deidara held up his hand, a small lump of clay resting in it, and watched as the mouth on his palm greedily munched on it, chewed it thoroughly, and then spit out a small sculpture of a bird. The bird chirped almost happily as it hopped off of his hand onto the ground and vanished into a cloud of smoke, reappearing as a larger bird which Deidara hopped onto. He glanced over his shoulder at Sasori and smiled. You wait here and act like one of those boring statues you think are so great, I'll be back in a moment. Before Sasori could offer a retort, Deidara and the bird were in the air, soaring high over the hill that masked Orochimaru's base. Deidara quickly fitted a small scope to his left eye, tucking the hair that normally covered that eye behind his ear, and began to scan the area. Seems like he's getting lazy, he thought to himself as he counted the number of sentries watching over the entrances. Only 5? We could have handled that many from close range and still not raised the alarm. There would, of course, be others who weren't so easily spotted from above, but given the lack of cover available in the area, there couldn't be that many. It seemed that the only real thing they'd need to worry about was Orochimaru himself, if that could be counted as a worry. Deidara's hand dipped into the bag, the mouth on his palm swallowing a large lump of clay, and a few seconds later, 5 small birds hopped out. He smiled down at them, enjoying what he considered to be rather nice artistic lines, and then watched as they leapt off his fingers and began to slowly circle towards the unsuspecting ninja below him. The birds were small enough that they probably looked like nothing more than sparrows as they made their way down. Certainly no one would see them and think anything of it. Realism had never been his style, but from a distance, they would look close enough to realistic to be overlooked until it was too late. Deidara adjusted his scope, checking to make sure that each of his creations was in position, and then formed the ram seal that would activate them. Art is a bang, he crowed happily as each bird exploded, killing the 5 men simultaneously. His first objective accomplished, Deidara returned to Sasori. We've got a clear path, he said with a grin. The two of them began to make their way towards the hill, neither hurrying nor hesitating. As they reached the base, a figure stepped out from behind a small rock formation. I'm disappointed, Orochimaru told them with a smile. I expected pain to at least send Itachi. Sasori remained as emotionless as ever, but Deidara couldn't help but feel a little annoyed not only by the insinuation that Itachi was somehow above him, but also by the fact that Orochimaru had apparently noticed when he took out the guards. Orochimaru rolled his eyes exaggeratedly. You didn't think I'd really just have 5 men standing out in the middle of nowhere waiting to be attacked, did you? I have 20 men dedicated just to watching for those 5 to be killed. Sasori shifted under his cloak and then said, We've come for the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki. Of course you have. You're a little earlier than I remember, but I knew you'd be here sooner or later for what's left of him. Unfortunately, I'm not done with him yet. We're also here for your head. Orochimaru cocked his head to the side and smirked. Still holding grudges, I see. His yellow eyes swept over Sasori's hunched body. I never understood your desire for that body, though I can appreciate the reason you choose it. We have the same goal in that area. Unfortunately, you can't have the Kyuubi or my head. Something shifted under Sasori's cloak and Orochimaru twisted to the side as what looked like a long tail shot out and stabbed into the rock he had been leaning against. Ku. How hasty, Orochimaru chuckled. I suppose there's no way I can talk you out of this. You don't really think you can beat us both, do you? Deidara asked. Between my art and his freaky little puppet show, you don't stand a chance, Deidara, you little shit, are you trying to annoy me? Sasori growled, his tail twitching in apparent agitation, though his face, partially hidden behind a dark cloth, remained the same. Deidara glanced at him and shrugged. We just have different tastes, I suppose, Orochimaru watched them argue, his chest shaking with suppressed mirth. Deidara-san, you might be right about the two of you being more than I can handle. He glanced back at the entrance to the base. Jugo, you can kill Deidara. Sasori-san and I will settle matters on our own. Something large and fast shot out of the entrance, rushing towards the two Akatsuki members as it strangely began to grow even bigger. Naruto found it strange to still be relatively unchained. They'd bound his wrists and attached him to the wall, of course, but usually his arms were pinned back and he was placed in a crouched position with even his neck shackled to the floor to keep him from moving. He was too weak to take any advantage of his freedom, but he could feel his chakras slowly beginning to flow the way it was supposed to. It wasn't something he'd felt much during the past few years. Suddenly, the door opened, the squeaking of the metal hinges making him wince. He didn't even bother looking up to see who was coming in. Probably, it was Jugo being returned or perhaps some food was being brought in. Normally they fed him around the time that his tenketsu began to open again. There was almost always a sedative in his meal, a way of keeping up contained until Hiroshi could close the tenketsu once more. In the beginning, he'd tried refusing to eat, hoping for a chance to get a little of his strength back, but if his plate wasn't clear with the food in his stomach after a few minutes, someone came in and used a large, probably dirty, needle on him. Plus, they took the food when they left. Since they obviously wouldn't let him go without taking the drugs and they were only too happy to let him starve himself into weakness, he started just eating the food and looking for some other way to regain the ability to use jutsu. Do it quick, one of the guards growled as someone shuffled into the cell. Orochimaru-sama wants him out, now. Of course, Hyuga Hiroshi's soft voice replied. Naruto frowned and looked up. They had never sent Hiroshi in to close his tenketsu while he was still awake. At best, they would have him wait outside until Orochimaru finished playing with him and then, as Naruto hovered between consciousness and unconsciousness, they went through with it. A few times, they'd let Naruto think he was escaping and had Hiroshi standing behind him so that the first few strikes came as a surprise. He watched carefully as Hiroshi made his way across the room and stood before him, the very picture of complete hopelessness. Hiroshi's shoulders were slumped, his eyes lowered and his movements half-hearted. Outside, there was shouting and the sound of footsteps racing by. Hiroshi seemed distracted, continuously looking back at the guard waiting at the door. Naruto had made a living spotting slim chances and exploiting them. Some had called it guts, others had thought it stupidity, but he'd found that if he focused all of his efforts into that one moment, he was good enough and lucky enough to get out of a lot of situations that others couldn't because they lacked the resolve to bet everything on a single, desperate, sliver of hope. This was another such moment. Even if he held out for another decade, which he knew he wouldn't be able to do, he doubted he'd ever have a moment where he wasn't drugged or being closely observed while Hiroshi closed his tenketsu. This moment was unique and he could either take advantage of it or wither away and die in his prison. Naruto didn't feel hope, that was long since gone, but he felt opportunity and that was enough. Jukin strikes that closed tenketsu required incredible precision and speed. More than that, they required certain points to be pressed that made others close easier. The first two strikes were almost always the same. One was near the middle of the chest, just to the right of the heart, where a large branching pathway of the Kirakuki was located. The other was below the lungs, right above the diaphragm where another nexus of coils existed. Pressing those two was key to the whole attack. Without them completely sealed, chakra still partially flowed within the body and the other tenketsu would open just a little bit quicker. In a fight, it wasn't quite as big of a deal if they weren't completely sealed. A partial seal, coupled with the pressing of so many other points, was more than enough to incapacitate an opponent. When you were trying to keep a prisoner, who happened to have a rather large amount of chakra, from breaking free, however, a partial seal meant that he would regain his strength sooner than expected. It all came down to two things. Tired and weary as Naruto was, could he dodge those first two strikes enough to keep the points from completely closing? And would Hiroshi be too distracted to notice that he hadn't done his job? There was also a third concern. When Naruto dodged, would the distracted Hiroshi accidentally hit some potentially vital spot that would kill him? Naruto didn't care about that one, however. He'd been in hell on earth for the last 2 years. The real thing couldn't be that bad by comparison. An unnatural focus came over Naruto as energy seemed to flow through his body. One split second, that was all he would have. One split second, in bad light, that could decide the rest of his life. One split second, in bad light, with a weak body, that could mean the difference between escape and being forced to watch his friends get killed before his eyes. Hiroshi's hands shot forward and Naruto's moment arrived. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.